In family court, my husband pointed a trembling finger at me, calling me an adulteress in front of the judge. He even dragged my supposed lover into the room to testify against me. I was on the verge of losing everything I had built: my logistics company, my house, and my reputation. The judge glared at me with pure contempt, ready to strip away my life's work. But when the man they accused of sleeping with me took the stand, he did not confess. Instead, he pulled out his phone and hit play on a recording that would send my husband to federal prison. I am Paige, 34 years old, and until that moment, my family thought they had successfully destroyed me. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to fight back against a family that wanted to see you fail. The fluorescent lights of the downtown Manhattan courthouse buzzed above me, but the real interrogation was happening at the plaintiff's table. Gavin, the man I had been married to for 6 years, was giving the performance of his life. He dabbed at his eyes with a perfectly pressed linen handkerchief, putting on a masterclass of fake devastation. His lawyer, a slick man radiating cheap cologne and expensive hourly rates, dramatically tossed a stack of glossy photographs onto the judge's bench. The photos showed me walking out of a boutique hotel in Midtown, deep in conversation with a tall, sharp-featured man. "Your Honor," Gavin's lawyer announced, his voice echoing in the silent room. "We are submitting Exhibit D photographic evidence of my client's wife, Paige, exiting a hotel with her paramour. This blatant infidelity causes immense emotional distress to my client. Therefore, we are formally requesting the immediate activation of the morality clause in their prenuptial agreement. My client is entitled to 100% ownership of her supply chain logistics company." I sat perfectly still, my hands folded neatly in my lap. I did not gasp. I did not cry. I just watched Gavin lower his handkerchief to reveal a smug, triumphant smirk directed right at me. He was a wealth manager, a man who dealt in risks and calculated returns. He thought I was just another hostile takeover. He thought he had outsmarted me by manipulating a toxic clause we had signed years ago, when I was young and foolish enough to trust him. Behind me in the gallery, the distinct sound of a scoff echoed through the quiet courtroom. It was my mother, Sylvia. I did not even need to turn around to know she was sitting there in her designer tweed suit, her perfectly highlighted hair framing a face that thrived on my humiliation. Sitting right beside her was my older sister, Madison, the golden child of the family, looking like she was attending a charity gala rather than a divorce hearing. "I always knew her cheap little software project was a fluke," Sylvia whispered loudly to one of her wealthy country club friends she had brought along for the show. "She is a college dropout with zero class, absolutely no morals, not like my Madison." Madison married a brilliant surgeon. Paige just chases after garbage and ruins the lives of good men like Gavin. Madison leaned over, her heavy gold bracelets clinking together. "I tried to tell Gavin years ago that she would embarrass him," Madison added, making sure her voice carried to the judge. "She has always been the black sheep, just reckless and selfish. It is honestly embarrassing to share a bloodline with her." Their words were supposed to hurt. They were supposed to trigger the defensive, insecure girl who used to beg for their approval. But that girl died a long time ago. I had spent my entire life being told I was a failure because I preferred coding logistics algorithms over attending high society luncheons. When I dropped out of college to launch my startup, my mother told me I was a disgrace to the family name. When my company hit an $80 million valuation last year, she told people Gavin was the real brains behind the operation. Now they were literally sitting in a courtroom cheering for the man who was trying to steal my empire. I glanced slightly over my shoulder. Sitting next to Madison was her husband, Dr. Elijah. He was a highly respected African-American neurosurgeon, a man who had built an impeccable reputation through years of grueling work and dedication. Unlike the rest of my toxic family, Elijah actually possessed integrity. He sat stiffly, staring straight ahead, looking deeply uncomfortable with his wife and mother-in-law's cruel commentary. He had no idea how deeply his own life was about to be dragged into this mess. The judge, an older man with a stern face and zero patience for courtroom theatrics, glared down at me. His expression was full of absolute contempt. He looked at me like I was exactly what my mother said I was, a reckless, deceitful woman trying to cheat a good, honest husband. "Ms. Page," the judge warned, his voice sharp. "The morality clause in your prenuptial agreement is explicitly clear. If these allegations of infidelity are substantiated, you will forfeit your entire equity stake in your company. Do you understand the severity of what is at stake here today?" "I understand perfectly, Your Honor," I replied, my voice completely steady. Gavin stood up, adjusting his custom Italian suit, feigning a heavy sigh. "Your Honor, I do not want to drag this out. It breaks my heart to do this to the woman I loved, but the truth must come to light. I call the man from the photographs to the stand. I call Dominic to testify." The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom opened, and Dominic walked down the center aisle. He moved with a quiet, undeniable confidence, wearing a sharp charcoal suit. My mother let out an audible gasp of theatrical scandal as he passed her row. Madison leaned in, whispering something derogatory to Elijah, who simply shook his head and crossed his arms. Dominic reached the front of the room. He did not look nervous. He did not look like a man caught in a lie or about to be exposed in a scandalous affair. He walked with the precision of a man who held all the winning cards. He stood tall before the judge, taking the oath with a steady, clear voice. Then he adjusted his suit jacket and turned to look directly at Gavin. Dominic did not flinch under the weight of the courtroom stairs. Instead, he smiled. It was a sharp, dangerous smile that immediately wiped the smug satisfaction right off my husband's face. Gavin swallowed hard, taking a slight step back as he realized the man he brought in to destroy me was about to burn his entire world to the ground. The bailiff stepped forward, holding out a worn leather Bible. "Please state your full name for the record." Dominic placed his right hand firmly on the book. "Dominic Carter." Gavin's attorney, a man named Collins who reeked of cheap cologne and sheer desperation, immediately pounced. "Your Honor, we have already established Mr. Carter's role in this proceeding. He is the paramour, the man who actively participated in destroying my client's marriage. We really do not need to hear his life story. We just need his confession on the record, so we can enforce the prenuptial agreement and give my client what he is owed." Dominic did not even look at the lawyer. He kept his dark, piercing eyes locked entirely on Gavin. "Actually, I am not a paramour. I am a licensed federal forensic accountant specializing in high-level corporate embezzlement and wire fraud." The murmurs in the gallery started instantly. I heard my mother, Sylvia, shift uncomfortably in her seat directly behind me. The heavy gold bracelets on her wrists clanked together as she whispered something frantic to my sister, Madison. They had spent the last 3 weeks bragging to their wealthy country club friends that my supposed lover was some penniless tech groupie I had picked up at a downtown coffee shop. That was the exact narrative Gavin had fed them, and they had swallowed it eagerly because it fit their lifelong belief that I was a naive, reckless disappointment who could not manage her own life. The judge frowned, peering over his thick reading glasses. "Forensic accountant. Mr. Carter, you are listed here as a hostile witness called by the plaintiff to testify regarding a breach of the morality clause." Dominic nodded respectfully. "I am aware, Your Honor. The plaintiff assumed I was romantically involved with his wife because we spent several late nights together entering and exiting the Midtown Hotel. What the plaintiff did not know is that the hotel's business center has a secure encrypted network. We were not having an affair. We were conducting a quiet, intensive audit of the plaintiff's offshore shell companies." Gavin shot up from his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Objection! This is absurd. He is lying to cover up the affair. He is trying to protect her shares." "Sit down," the judge barked, banging his gavel once with a sharp crack. "I will hear what the witness has to say." Dominic reached into the breast pocket of his tailored charcoal suit and pulled out his smartphone. He tapped the screen a few times with agonizing precision. Gavin watched him, the smug, arrogant confidence completely melting from his face. It was replaced by a sudden, sickening realization. The man he had brought into this courtroom to humiliate me and steal my life's work was not a pawn. He was the executioner. Your Honor. Dominic continued, his voice echoing clearly across the wood-paneled room. While tracking the missing corporate funds that Mr. Gavin claimed were lost in bad investments, I legally intercepted a voicemail left on an unsecured server. I believe this audio will clear up any confusion regarding my relationship with Paige. More importantly, it will clarify exactly why the plaintiff is so desperate to seize total control of her company today. Collins scrambled to his feet, his face red and sweating profusely. Objection. Unverified audio. Privacy violations. This is a civil divorce hearing, not a federal tribunal. You cannot play random audio files in my courtroom. The judge held up a hand, silencing the panicked lawyer. You brought this witness here to prove a morality breach, counselor. You opened this door. If he has evidence explaining his presence at that hotel with the defendant, I am going to hear it. Proceed, Mr. Carter. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting gracefully in my lap. I did not look back at my mother. I did not look at my golden child sister. I kept my eyes fixed entirely on Gavin. I watched a single drop of sweat trace its way down his temple. He gripped the edge of the plaintiff's table so hard his knuckles turned stark white. For years, he had used his charm and aggressive financial jargon to manipulate me. He treated my supply chain startup like a cute little hobby right up until it hit an $80 million valuation. Then suddenly, he wanted to be the man in charge. He thought I was too weak to fight back. He thought cutting off my credit cards and isolating me from my family would break my spirit. He was dead wrong. Dominic held his phone up to the courtroom microphone and tapped the screen. A sharp beep filled the room, followed immediately by Gavin's voice. It was clear, arrogant, and unmistakably cruel. Just wire the $2 million from Paige's corporate account to Elijah's wellness clinic. The black doctor only knows how to cut open brains, he doesn't read the ledgers. Once it's washed, cut my wife's credit lines. The audio cut off. The silence that followed was absolute, suffocating, and incredibly heavy. It was the exact kind of silence that happens right before a massive explosive shockwave hits. Gavin's face drained of all remaining color, transforming into a sickly, ghostly pale. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was waiting for the concrete to rush up and meet him. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Collins, his lawyer, slowly sank back into his chair, physically distancing himself from his own client. Then the explosion hit. The gallery erupted into absolute chaos. My mother Sylvia let out a sharp, genuine gasp of horror, realizing that her perfect son-in-law had just confessed to a massive financial crime in a recorded audio file. Madison, my pristine sister who had spent the last hour smirking at my downfall, suddenly grabbed her designer handbag, as if the expensive leather could shield her from the incoming shrapnel. She knew about that money. She had been spending it on European vacations and luxury cars, masking it as charity work for her fake foundation. Now it was all out in the open air. But the most dangerous reaction did not come from my mother or my sister. In the very back row of the courtroom, away from the immediate drama, sat Dr. Elijah. My brother-in-law was a man of immense pride and unshakable integrity. He had fought through systemic prejudice, grueling medical residencies, and endless social barriers to become one of the most respected neurosurgeons in the state. He had come today solely to support his wife Madison, entirely unaware of the toxic, illegal games she and Gavin were playing behind the scenes. Hearing his own name, his own medical clinic, and a blatant racial slight used as a punchline for a money laundering scheme was the spark that ignited a roaring fire. Elijah stood up abruptly. The violent scrape of his wooden chair against the floorboards cut through the panicked murmurs of the crowd like a gunshot. He did not say a single word, but he did not have to. His eyes were wide, burning with a cold, terrifying fury. He stared directly past the judge, past Dominic, and locked his unblinking gaze dead onto Gavin and Madison. The veins in his neck pulsed visibly. The pristine, untouchable world my family had built on lies was shattering into a million jagged pieces, and Elijah was ready to bring the whole structure down. The low wooden gate separating the gallery from the trial floor was supposed to be a strict boundary, but Elijah pushed right through it. The heavy hinges groaned in protest. A court bailiff instantly stepped forward, with a hand resting on his utility belt ready to intercept, but the judge raised a single finger. The judge was a sharp man, and he recognized the difference between a threat and a man whose entire life had just been violated. The bailiff backed down. I sat perfectly still beside Dominic watching the shockwave hit. Elijah did not look at me or the judge. He marched directly toward the plaintiff's table, where Gavin was practically trying to merge with the hardwood floor. Madison scrambled out of her seat in the gallery, her designer heels clicking frantically as she chased after her husband. "Elijah, wait!" Madison cried out, her voice shrill and trembling with manufactured panic. She reached out, grabbing his forearm with both hands, digging her manicured nails into his suit jacket. "Honey, please stop. You are making a scene. It is just a misunderstanding. Gavin can explain everything." Elijah stopped. He looked down at Madison's hands, clutching his arm, and a wave of pure, unadulterated revulsion washed over his face. He jerked his arm away with such force that Madison stumbled backward, clutching her chest as if he had struck her. "Do not touch me." Elijah's voice was a low, dangerous rumble that echoed off the high ceiling. It was deep and commanding, the voice of a man accustomed to directing surgical teams during life-or-death crises. It commanded absolute silence. He turned his attention back to my husband. "I want to hear Gavin explain it," Elijah said, stepping so close to the plaintiff's table that Gavin shrank back into his chair. "I want to hear exactly how my pristine medical practice, my life's work, ended up on an intercepted audio recording discussing $2 million of stolen money." Gavin opened his mouth, but only a pathetic stammering sound came out. He looked to his lawyer Collins, but Collins was busy stuffing his expensive pens back into his leather briefcase, completely checking out of the impending disaster. "Explain it to me, Gavin," Elijah demanded, his voice rising, filling every corner of the room. "You sit at my dining table every Thanksgiving. You drink my wine. You smile in my face and call me brother. And behind my back, you are using my wellness clinic as a washing machine for your corporate theft." Madison started sobbing loudly, burying her face in her hands. "Elijah, I swear to you, I had no idea," she wailed, attempting to play the delicate victim. My mother, Sylvia, rushed to the barrier flanking Madison and glaring at Elijah. "Elijah, calm down," Sylvia hissed, trying to exert her usual matriarchal control. "You are embarrassing the family. We can sort this out quietly at home. Do not let Paige's disgusting little circus ruin Madison's day." Elijah whipped around to face Sylvia, and the sheer intensity of his glare actually made my mother step back. "Your family is the embarrassment, Sylvia," he barked. "Do you have any idea what it took for me to build that clinic? Do you have the slightest clue what a black man in this city has to go through to earn the kind of reputation I have? I did not get a trust fund. I did not get country club introductions. I worked grueling 100-hour weeks in my surgical residency while you people were summering in the Hamptons. I fought tooth and nail against a system designed to keep me out just to get my foot in the door. I had to be flawless. I had to be 10 times better than every other surgeon in that hospital just to be considered an equal." He turned back to Madison, his eyes filled with a heartbreak so profound it made my own chest ache. "I built an impeccable name, a name that people trust. And you let your sister's pathetic excuse for a husband use it as a shield for wire fraud because he thought the black doctor only knows how to cut open brains." The courtroom was dead silent. Even the court reporter had paused her typing, her hands hovering above the keys. I sat beside Dominic, watching the implosion of the illusion my mother had spent decades curating. Sylvia always acted like she had done Elijah a favor by allowing him to marry into her pristine white upper-class lineage. In reality, Elijah was the only one among them with an ounce of genuine worth. Judge the slick lawyer Collins suddenly stammered, rising to his feet. "My client invokes his Fifth Amendment rights regarding that audio. We request an immediate recess." "Denied," the judge snapped, leaning over the bench and staring a hole straight through Gavin. "Your client is the one who brought this circus into my courtroom, Mr. Collins. He demanded a ruling on a morality clause to seize his wife's company. I am not granting a recess until I get to the bottom of this financial web. Mr. Gavin, you will explain the audio recording right now, or I will have the bailiff place you in handcuffs for perjury and attempted fraud against this court." Gavin was trapped. He looked at the judge, then at Dominic's cold stare, and finally at Elijah, who looked ready to tear him apart with his bare hands. The walls were closing in on him rapidly. He could not deny the audio because it was his exact voice giving exact instructions to steal my money. He could not run. Gavin's breathing grew shallow and erratic. His eyes darted around the room like a cornered rat looking for any possible sewer drain to escape through. He looked at my mother, who was still glaring at Elijah. He looked at Madison, who was weeping into a tissue. Then his gaze locked onto me. A desperate, frantic energy suddenly seized him. He practically dove toward his leather briefcase on the floor, tearing at the brass buckles. He shoved his lawyer aside and ripped open a thick manila folder. "I am not taking the fall for this," Gavin shouted, his voice cracking with hysteria. "I did not steal anything. I was just the wealth manager executing authorized directives." He pulled out a thick document, heavily stamped with official notary seals, and slammed it down onto the plaintiff's table. He pointed a trembling finger at me and then swung his arm to point directly at my mother in the gallery. "I was following orders," Gavin yelled wildly, looking up at the judge. "The $2 million transfer to the clinic. The frozen credit lines. All of it. I did not act alone. I have the signed legally binding authorization forms right here. Paige and Sylvia signed off on every single transaction. They authorized the transfers. It was their money and they moved it. I am just the middleman. They are the ones who set up the entire scheme." The silence that followed was absolute. Elijah froze, his eyes darting toward me. Madison dropped her tissue, her mouth falling open in shock. I sat in my chair, my face perfectly blank, while beside me Dominic let out a soft, almost imperceptible breath of amusement. The trap had just sprung. Exactly 6 months earlier, the air inside my mother's sprawling Connecticut McMansion was thick with the scent of roasted turkey sage and suffocating passive aggression. Sylvia sat at the head of the mahogany dining table, presiding over the Thanksgiving feast like a monarch holding court. The crystal glasses gleamed under an oversized chandelier, and the silver cutlery scraped against fine china. To anyone looking through the massive bay windows, we were the picture of American aristocratic perfection. Inside that room, however, the reality was an entirely different kind of feast. I was the main course. Main. I sat near the end of the table, checking a quick server status update on my phone for my logistics company. We were weeks away from filing our initial public offering, and the pressure was immense. I had barely slept in 3 days, ensuring our supply chain algorithms were flawless before Wall Street tore them apart. "Put the phone away, Paige," Sylvia commanded, her voice slicing through the polite dinner jazz playing in the background. "It is Thanksgiving. Can you try to pretend you have social skills for one evening?" I locked my phone and placed it face down on the table. "I was just checking on the platform, Mom. We have a major deployment tonight." Madison rolled her eyes from across the table, adjusting the heavy diamond tennis necklace resting against her collarbone. Always the workaholic. "You know, Paige, if you actually let Gavin do his job as your husband, you would not have to stress over your little computer projects during family time." Gavin, who was sitting directly across from me, offered a modest, self-deprecating smile. He swirled his expensive bourbon, the ice clinking against the glass. "I try to tell her, Madison. I really do. But Paige likes to be in control. It is her baby. I just want to help her manage the big leagues now that the numbers are getting serious." Sylvia dabbed her mouth with a linen napkin, her eyes gleaming with a predatory focus. "Well, that actually brings us to the main event of the evening." She stood up, walked over to the antique mahogany sideboard, and retrieved a thick legal envelope. She did not hand it to Gavin. She walked directly over to my chair and slid the heavy manila envelope onto my plate, right over my half-eaten turkey. "Happy Thanksgiving," Sylvia said, her lips curving into a tight, practiced smile. I looked down at the envelope and then up at my husband. Gavin was watching me intently, his posture rigid. I pulled the tab and slid the heavy stack of paper out. The bold black letters at the top of the first page practically jumped off the heavy cardstock. "Voting rights transfer and irrevocable proxy agreement." I scanned the first paragraph, my heart rate remaining steady despite the sudden drop in my stomach. The document was a complete surrender. It stipulated that I would transfer 51% of my voting shares and absolute board control to Gavin, immediately preceding the IPO. It stripped me of my own company and handed the keys to my husband. "What is this?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. "It is a safety net," Gavin chimed in, leaning forward and folding his hands on the table. "Paige, the IPO process is brutal. Institutional investors want to see seasoned financial leadership at the helm. You built a great software product, but you are not a corporate financier. I am. I know these Wall Street guys. If I take the voting control, we project a united, strong front. It protects our future." I looked at the signature lines. Gavin had already signed it. It had already been notarized. They had brought this to Thanksgiving dinner to ambush me in front of the entire family, using the holiday as leverage. "I am the founder and CEO Gavin. I wrote the code. I secured the venture capital. Institutional investors want the person who built the $80 million valuation to lead the company. I am not signing away my voting rights." Sylvia slammed her hand down on the table, rattling the crystal water glasses. "You are being completely irrational and ungrateful." I looked up at my mother. "Ungrateful for what exactly?" "For you trying to hand my company to my husband." Sylvia sneered, her face twisting with the same condescension she had used to break me down since I was a child. "You are just a tech geek, Paige. You sit in dark rooms staring at screens. Wall Street wants a strong man like Gavin leading the board, not a stubborn girl who dresses like a teenager and refuses to listen to reason. He is a wealth manager. He actually understands how the real world works. You are going to blow this entire deal because you are too arrogant to let a man take the reins." Madison took a delicate sip of her wine. "Mom is right, Paige. You are embarrassing Gavin. He has to explain to his colleagues why his wife refuses to let him manage her assets. It makes him look weak. Just sign the paper and go back to your coding. Let the adults handle the business." I looked at the three of them. My mother, who had never praised a single thing I did. My sister, who viewed my hard work as a social liability. And my husband, the man who promised to be my partner, sitting there waiting to steal my empire. They honestly believed I was weak enough to cave under their collective pressure. They thought the insecure girl who used to beg for Sylvia's love would just hand over a billion-dollar future to avoid a family argument. I picked up the heavy brass pen sitting next to the document. Gavin leaned forward, a hungry, victorious gleam in his eyes. Sylvia crossed her arms, looking deeply satisfied with her parenting. I held the pen over the signature line. Then I calmly placed it down on the table. I picked up the stack of legal papers, tore them cleanly in half, and dropped the pieces directly into my gravy. "The company is mine," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "My code, my logistics, my equity. You want to run a company, Gavin? Go build one yourself instead of trying to steal your wife's." I stood up, grabbing my coat from the back of the chair. Sylvia began screaming about disrespect and disowning me, but I did not stop. I walked out the front door into the freezing November night, leaving their toxic dinner behind me. I got into my car, locking the doors and starting the engine. My hands were shaking, but not from fear. It was pure adrenaline. I pulled out of the long, winding driveway, eager to get back to the city to secure my legal team first thing in the morning. I thought the worst was over. I thought I had drawn my line in the sand. As I merged onto the dark interstate, my phone on the passenger seat chimed with a sharp notification. Then it chimed again. And again. I glanced over as the screen lit up with a rapid-fire cascade of terrifying alerts. Alert Chase Bank, your Platinum Visa has been suspended. Alert Wells Fargo, your personal checking account has been frozen due to suspicious activity. Alert First National, corporate credit line access denied. Alert Silicon Valley Bank, master account locked. Contact your branch administrator. The notifications poured in an endless stream of digital red flags. I pulled the car onto the shoulder of the highway, slamming it into park. I grabbed my phone, my chest tightening as I tried to log into my banking app. Access denied. I tried my corporate portal. Access denied. Contact primary account holder Gavin Carter. The trap had not been the Thanksgiving dinner. The dinner was just the distraction. While I was sitting at that table, Gavin had executed a total financial blackout. Every dollar I owned, every credit line I relied on to run my life and my business had been simultaneously severed. I sat alone in the freezing car, on the side of a dark highway completely locked out of the empire I had built. I did not let the panic consume me on that freezing highway. Panic is a useless emotion when your entire life is under siege. I simply put the car in drive and headed straight for Manhattan. The biggest venture capital dinner of my career was scheduled for Monday evening at an exclusive restaurant in Tribeca, and it was the only thing standing between me and a successful initial public offering. I had spent the entire weekend fighting through automated phone trees and emergency bank protocols, utilizing every favor I had to secure a single temporary corporate credit card. I thought I had contained the damage. I thought Gavin was just throwing a childish tantrum attempting to flex his financial muscles to scare me into submission. The restaurant was a fortress of low lighting, velvet booths, and quiet wealth. I sat across the table from three of the most ruthless venture capitalists on Wall Street. These were the kingmakers, the men who could either launch my company into the stratosphere or crush it before it ever hit the trading floor. I was pitching the final valuation for my supply chain software, and the evening was proceeding flawlessly. I walked them through the predictive algorithms, the efficiency metrics, and the projected quarterly growth. I explained how our logistics platform would revolutionize global shipping routes, saving corporations billions in lost revenue. They were leaning in, asking sharp questions, and nodding with genuine approval. They were ready to commit the final round of funding. I had won. Then the leather folio containing the exorbitant bill arrived at the table. I did not miss a beat. I maintained unwavering eye contact with the lead investor, finishing my thought on international shipping logistics as I casually slipped my temporary corporate card into the folder and handed it back to the waiter. 10 minutes passed. The conversation shifted to golf handicaps and weekend homes in the Hamptons. Then the waiter reappeared at my shoulder. He leaned down, his voice a discreet, hushed whisper designed to protect my dignity. "Ma'am, I am so sorry, but this card has been declined." The conversation of the table ground to an immediate halt. Three pairs of predatory eyes snapped directly to me. In the high-stakes world of venture capital, a founder who cannot pay a dinner bill is a founder who is secretly insolvent. It is the ultimate red flag. I kept my expression perfectly serene. "There must be a fraud alert due to the unusually high amount," I said smoothly, offering a polite, dismissive smile. "Please excuse me for just one moment, gentlemen. I will call my bank and have it cleared up immediately." As I stood up, my phone vibrated violently inside my blazer pocket. I pulled it out as I walked away from the table, heading toward the back of the restaurant. The screen lit up with a new message from Gavin. It was not a text, it was a photograph. The image showed a stack of legal documents resting on his mahogany desk. The top page was clearly visible. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Divorce papers. In the bottom corner of the photo, Gavin had caught his own reflection in a mirror wearing a sickeningly smug smirk. Beneath the photo was a single line of text. "Sign the company over, or you do not get a dime to pay your server." He was engaging in pure psychological warfare. He had timed the total financial freeze perfectly, waiting until the exact moment I was sitting in front of the most important investors of my life to pull the plug. He wanted me to experience maximum humiliation. He wanted me to walk back to that table a broken, weeping mess and beg the venture capitalist to cover my bill, effectively killing my own initial public offering. He thought he had outmaneuvered me by locking me out of the user interface of my own banking software. He forgot one crucial detail. I am not a helpless trophy wife. I built this software from the ground up. I walked into the women's restroom, checking beneath the stalls to ensure I was completely alone. I locked the heavy wooden door of the handicap stall and sat down, pulling my ultra-thin laptop from my sleek leather tote bag. I rested the computer on my knees and flipped it open. The screen glowed to life, illuminating the dark, cramped space. Gavin thought he had locked me out because he changed the passwords and revoked my administrative access on the front end. But I wrote the original source code in my dingy college dorm room. I built the architecture of this entire financial tracking system. I know every single line of code, and I know every hidden backdoor I programmed for absolute emergencies. My fingers flew across the keyboard, bypassing the graphic user interface entirely and pulling up a raw command terminal. I typed in a string of administrative overrides, executing a silent protocol that Gavin, with all his wealth management degrees, did not even know existed. I watched the black screen fill with scrolling green text as the system processed my encrypted credentials. It took exactly 47 seconds to shatter the digital walls my husband had erected. The screen flooded with cascading lines of data. I bypassed his superficial lockouts and breached the master ledger. I thought I was just going to unlock my temporary card and transfer some emergency funds to cover the dinner. But the numbers scrolling rapidly across my screen made the blood freeze in my veins. This was not just a simple account freeze. Gavin was not just holding my money hostage, he was actively draining it. I watched in real time as massive blocks of capital were being aggressively siphoned out of my corporate operating accounts. Hundreds of thousands of dollars were moving simultaneously, systematically structured to stay just under the threshold that would trigger standard federal banking alerts. It was a highly sophisticated wash routing the cash through a dizzying maze of offshore shell companies and blind trusts. He was gutting my company from the inside out, stripping the equity bare before the initial public offering could even take place. I ran a rapid trace on the primary routing numbers, my eyes tracking the digital breadcrumbs as they bounced across servers from the Cayman Islands to Delaware. I needed to see where the bulk of my stolen empire was landing. I wrote a quick script to strip away the proxy layers and hit the final execution command to unmask the destination account. The screen refreshed, and the name of the receiving account flashed in bright green text. I stared at the glowing letters, my breath completely catching in my throat. The money was not just going to Gavin. The primary destination account, receiving millions of my stolen dollars, belonged to a registered charity. A very specific, highly publicized charity that my family loved to brag about at their country club luncheons. The Madison Hope Foundation. The green text burned into my retinas like acid. The Madison Hope Foundation. My sister had launched that charity 3 years ago with a massive press release and a tearful speech at the country club about giving back to underprivileged youth. I watched the command terminal as another wire transfer executed in real time. $50,000 vanished from my corporate logistics account, bounced through a Cayman holding company, and quietly deposited straight into Madison's supposedly altruistic foundation. I typed furiously, running a deep trace on the IP addresses authorizing the transactions. Gavin was not operating from a random burner phone or a public network. He was pinging directly off the secured server in his downtown wealth management office. He was so arrogant. He truly thought my financial blackout would send me into a blind panic, rendering me entirely incapable of tracking his digital footprints. The data scrolling across my screen illuminated years of meticulously crafted lies. I wrote a rapid sequence script to cross-reference the offshore holding companies with the Madison Hope Foundation's internal ledgers. I watched the dates of the massive corporate dumps align perfectly with major events in my sister's life. A sudden transfer of $200,000 last July matched the exact week Madison bought a sprawling summer villa on the Amalfi Coast. Another $150,000 in October aligned perfectly with her walking into my house wearing a limited edition Birkin bag and a custom diamond Cartier watch. Whenever I had asked how her nonprofit was doing, Madison would simply smirk and brag about her highly successful charity galas. She claimed the wealthy donors in her elite social circle were just incredibly generous. My mother, Sylvia, had constantly praised Madison for her philanthropic brilliance, while simultaneously telling me my supply chain software was an embarrassing waste of time. Now, the bitter, undeniable truth stared back at me in stark white code. Madison was not a successful philanthropist. She was a parasite. My mother and my sister were funding their European vacations and luxury shopping sprees with the capital I had bled to build. They were using my husband as their personal bank robber. I sat back against the cold tile of the bathroom stall, forcing my breathing to slow. The rage simmering in my chest was absolute, but I could not afford to act on raw emotion. Gavin was a licensed federal wealth manager. He knew exactly how to structure these illicit transfers to look like authorized corporate investments. If I walked into a civil court tomorrow and filed for a divorce screaming about embezzlement, his lawyers would instantly tie my company up in endless litigation. The judge would freeze my assets indefinitely. The venture capitalists sitting outside this bathroom door would pull their funding immediately. The IPO would completely collapse, and Gavin would snatch the devalued remains of my empire for pennies on the dollar. I could not just fight him in a standard court battle. I had to obliterate him completely. I needed evidence so airtight and universally damning that no corporate lawyer could defend him. I needed someone who could pull the digital ledgers from the shadows and drag them into the blinding light of a federal courtroom. I needed a ghost. I closed the banking portal and launched a heavily encrypted browser, routing my connection through 5 different international servers to mask my location. During the early days of building my logistics startup, I had to navigate the darker corners of the web to protect my proprietary algorithms from corporate espionage. I knew exactly where to look for the kind of talent I required. I accessed a secure underground forum entirely dedicated to high-level data retrieval and offshore financial extraction. I bypassed the standard contractors and navigated directly to a locked messaging board reserved for elite operatives. I typed in a specific alphanumeric sequence. There was only one man in the country with the exact combination of forensic accounting expertise and ruthless digital hacking skills needed to dismantle Gavin's firewall. Dominic Carter. He was a licensed federal auditor who operated entirely off the grid, specializing in tracking stolen wealth for high-net-worth clients who could not rely on traditional law enforcement. I opened a secure peer-to-peer chat window and initiated an encrypted audio call. The line hissed with static for 10 seconds before a sharp click signaled the connection. Speak, a deep, calm voice commanded. I need a full forensic extraction, I said, keeping my voice low and steady. Domestic corporate accounts bleeding into offshore shells, and a registered charity. The target is a licensed wealth manager with high-level encryption. I need absolute proof of wire fraud and embezzlement. And I need it done quietly. The voice on the other end did not hesitate. The retainer is $500,000 wire transfer only. My audits leave no trace, but if your target is a licensed manager, this will require physical proximity to his internal network. I need access to his blind spots. I pulled a sleek black titanium credit card from my hidden inner blazer pocket. It was an off-the-books emergency reserve account linked to a private server in Switzerland completely untouched by Gavin's financial freeze. The funds will be routed to your account in 5 minutes, I replied. I can give you direct access to his network. He operates out of the Midtown Hotel Business Center on Thursday nights. We will start there. Consider it done, Dominic said. The line went dead. I closed the laptop and slipped it back into my tote bag. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror, smoothing my blazer and wiping away the single tear of betrayal that had managed to escape. My husband, my mother, and my sister had plotted to steal my life's work. They wanted to humiliate me and leave me with absolutely nothing. I unlocked the stall door and walked back out into the dining room to close a multi-million-dollar deal. I was going to pay the bill with my Swiss Reserve card, secure my venture capital, and then I was going to burn my family to the ground. The grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel was bathed in the warm golden light of 1,000 crystal chandeliers. This was the crown jewel of my sister's social calendar, the annual Madison Hope Foundation Winter Gala. The room was packed with Manhattan's elite sipping vintage champagne and wearing fortunes on their wrists. I stood at the top of the grand staircase looking down at the sea of silk and tuxedos. My own attire was a stark contrast to the extreme opulence below, with every personal and corporate account completely frozen by Gavin. I had exactly $84 in cash to my name money. I had scraped from the bottom of an old gym bag. I could not afford to rent a designer gown or hire a glam squad. Instead, I was wearing a vintage emerald green slip dress I had found at a thrift store in Brooklyn for $40. It was simple, unbranded, and completely lacking in the heavy, ostentatious embellishments my family preferred. Yet as I descended the marble steps, the deep green silk hugged my frame perfectly, and I carried myself with the absolute unshakable certainty of a woman who possessed total clarity. Dominic had sent me a single encrypted message 10 minutes before I arrived. The digital extraction was complete. We had every hidden ledger, every forged authorization, and every offshore routing number. The ghost had delivered. I barely reached the edge of the ballroom floor before the designated welcome committee intercepted me. Madison marched toward me like a heat-seeking missile flanked by our mother Sylvia and two of their wealthiest country club associates. Madison was draped in a custom-beaded couture gown that easily cost $20,000. Looking at the intricate beadwork, all I could see were the stolen routing numbers from my corporate accounts. My logistics software had literally paid for the dress on her back. "What are you doing here?" Madison hissed, her voice pitched low, but sharp enough to cut glass. She positioned her body to block my path to the main floor. "You were not invited, Paige." I smiled, taking a flute of sparkling water from a passing waiter. "I came to support your philanthropic endeavors, Madison. After all, we both know I am your biggest donor." Sylvia stepped forward, her eyes scanning my thrifted dress with profound disgust. "Look at you," she sneered. "You look like a street peddler who wandered in from the cold. I told you not to come to this event and embarrass us. We already have enough damage control to do with your investors." Madison crossed her arms, her diamond bracelets clinking together. She looked at her friends, offering them an exaggerated sigh of pity before turning her predatory gaze back to me. The fake sympathy on her face was almost Oscar-worthy. "Mom was right," Madison said, raising her voice just enough so the surrounding guests would hear the juicy family gossip. "You should have just let Gavin handle the big boy numbers. But no, you had to be the stubborn girl who dresses like a teenager and thinks she can play CEO. Now you are broke. Your accounts are locked. Your company is hemorrhaging. You do not even have a credit card that works. You are financially ruined, Paige." The elite guests standing nearby leaned in hungry for the spectacle. They expected me to run. They expected the disgraced sister to turn around and flee into the freezing night, hiding my face in shame. Instead, I took a slow, deliberate sip of my water. "I am perfectly fine, Madison," I said, my voice carrying a terrifying calm. "I just wanted to see exactly what my money bought tonight. The floral arrangements are beautiful, by the way." Madison scoffed, rolling her eyes. "Security?" she snapped, gesturing to a guard standing near the entrance. "Please escort my sister out. She is causing a disturbance." "I am not causing a disturbance," I replied, holding my ground. "I am here to make a pledge. Is that not the entire point of this gala?" Before the security guard could reach me, the loud chime of a crystal glass being tapped echoed across the ballroom. The master of ceremonies had taken the stage, signaling the beginning of the open pledge drive. Madison glared at me, shooting a warning look at the guard. "We will deal with you in a minute," she whispered harshly, before plastering on her radiant philanthropic smile and gliding toward the stage to take the microphone. I followed her, slipping effortlessly through the crowd. Sylvia tried to grab my arm, but I sidestepped her completely, my eyes locked on the stage. Madison stood behind the podium, bathing in the applause of the wealthy donors. "Thank you all for your incredible generosity," she beamed, her voice echoing through the massive speakers. "Tonight, the Madison Hope Foundation is asking you to dig deep. Every dollar you pledge goes directly to providing resources for underprivileged youth. We rely on your strength and your wealth to keep our mission alive. Who will start our pledge drive tonight?" I stepped up to the secondary microphone positioned in the center aisle of the ballroom. I did not wait for the auctioneer to acknowledge me. I tapped the microphone once, and the sharp feedback instantly silenced the room. Hundreds of heads turned in my direction. Madison's smile froze on her face, instantly hardening into a mask of pure panic. "I would like to make the first pledge," I announced, my voice ringing out with crystal clarity. Madison gripped the edges of the podium. "Turn her microphone off," she hissed at the sound technician, but he was too slow. "I pledge exactly 50 cents, I said, looking directly into Madison's terrified eyes. "Because according to the offshore shell company ledgers I pulled this afternoon, that is exactly what this fake charity is legally worth before the IRS audits it for laundering stolen corporate funds." The silence that slammed into the ballroom was suffocating. It was a heavy physical weight that dropped over the crowd. Glasses hovered halfway to mouths. Whispers died in throats. From across the room, standing near the VIP tables, I saw Dr. Elijah. He had been quietly chatting with a hospital board member, but my words cut through the silence like a gunshot. Elijah stopped mid-sentence. His posture went completely rigid. He looked at me standing at the microphone and then slowly turned his head to look at his wife on the stage. Madison was ghostly pale, clutching the wooden podium as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. She could not speak. She could not formulate a lie fast enough to cover the massive crater I had just blown in her pristine reputation. Elijah did not rush to defend her. He did not yell at me. He just stared at Madison, his eyes narrowing with a cold, calculating suspicion. The seed of doubt had been planted, and the roots were already tearing the foundation apart. The heavy oak front door of our townhouse did not just open, it slammed against the interior wall with enough force to crack the drywall. I was sitting at the kitchen island, bathed in the pale moonlight filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows, still wearing the emerald slip dress from the gala. I had not bothered to turn on the lights. I was simply waiting. Gavin stormed into the foyer like a man possessed. His bespoke tuxedo jacket was unbuttoned, his tie ripped off and hanging loosely around his neck. The polished, composed facade of the elite Manhattan wealth manager had completely evaporated. In its place was a cornered, desperate animal. He marched directly toward the kitchen island and hurled a massive stack of thick legal documents across the marble countertop. They fanned out, stopping mere inches from my folded hands. The bold black lettering on the top page glared up at me. "Petition for dissolution of marriage." Right beneath it was a copy of our prenuptial agreement. "Are you completely out of your mind?" he screamed, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "You crashed a high society charity event looking like absolute trash and screamed insane conspiracy theories into a microphone. Do you have any idea what you just did?" Elijah practically dragged Madison out the back door. "The foundation board members are demanding an emergency meeting tomorrow morning. You humiliated my firm. You humiliated your family." I remained perfectly still, watching a vein throb violently in his neck. "I did not humiliate anyone, Gavin," I replied, keeping my tone eerily calm. "I simply stated a mathematical fact. You cannot launder stolen corporate funds through a registered nonprofit and expect the math to magically disappear." Gavin slammed his palms flat onto the marble island, leaning over the documents until his face was inches from mine. His breath smelled of expensive scotch and raw panic. "There is no stolen money, Paige. There is only a mentally unstable woman who cannot handle the stress of running a logistics startup." He pulled a sleek silver pen from his pocket and threw it on top of the divorce papers. Then his eyes narrowed and his upper lip curled into a vicious sneer. "Or maybe this is not about business at all. Maybe this is about that weird guy you were sitting with at the coffee shop in Brooklyn yesterday." I blinked, feigning mild surprise. He had been tracking me. He had actually seen me meeting with Dominic to finalize the offshore extraction protocol. "Do you think I am stupid?" Gavin spat, standing up straight and pacing the length of the kitchen. "I had my security team put a tail on you the second I froze your accounts. I know you have been running around the city meeting with some low-rent street trash. Is that what this is? Are you trying to blow up our marriage and your own initial public offering for some pathetic affair? You are projecting your own failures onto me to justify ruining your life for another man." It was a masterful display of gaslighting. He was attempting to build a narrative that painted me as a hysterical, cheating wife lashing out at her successful husband. He wanted to use my alleged instability to legally justify why he had seized control of my company. When the cheating accusation failed to elicit the tears he expected, Gavin shifted his strategy. He moved to the most vulnerable target he could find, deploying the exact psychological warfare my mother Sylvia had used to keep me in line for 30 years. "Look at yourself, Paige," he said, his voice dropping to a low, mockingly sympathetic register. "You have always been a mess. Sylvia warned me about this before we even got married. She told me you were frantic, paranoid, and fundamentally unlovable. She said you would eventually self-destruct and take anyone standing too close down with you." He stepped closer, wrapping his fingers around the edge of the marble island. "You are just a frightened little girl playing dress-up as a CEO. You do not understand how real wealth operates. You do not understand the big boy numbers. I tried to protect you. I tried to manage the capital so your amateur mistakes would not sink the entire enterprise. But you are too stubborn and too arrogant to accept help. Now you have nothing. Your accounts are zeroed out. Your venture capitalists will run for the hills the second they hear about your public meltdown at the Pierre. No one will ever believe a single word you say." He tapped the silver pen against the divorce petition. "Sign the papers, Paige. Sign the company over to my management group and walk away. Take the pathetic buyout outlined in the prenuptial agreement. If you sign right now, I will call off my lawyers. I will let you walk out of here with enough cash to rent a cheap apartment with your new boyfriend. If you refuse, I will drag you through federal court until you are bankrupt, broken, and begging me for a settlement." He expected me to shatter. He expected me to fall to pieces, sobbing uncontrollably at the realization that my mother and my husband shared the exact same miserable opinion of my worth. He needed me to feel entirely powerless, so I would surrender the one thing he actually wanted: the master administrative rights to my logistics software. I looked down at the divorce petition. I looked at the attached prenuptial agreement which Gavin had aggressively amended behind my back, claiming full ownership of any corporate assets acquired during the marriage. Then I looked up at him. I did not cry. I did not scream. I did not even frown. I smiled. It was a bright, genuine, radiant smile that made Gavin physically flinch. I reached out and grabbed the silver pen. Without a single moment of hesitation, I flipped to the final page of the divorce petition. I signed my name with a massive, enthusiastic flourish. I flipped to the asset relinquishment forms and signed those too. I initialed every single page of the amended prenuptial agreement, handing the entire stack of documents back to him. "Done," I said brightly, placing the pen gently on the counter. Gavin stared at the signed documents in absolute bewilderment. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He had prepared for a massive screaming match. He had prepared for a grueling negotiation. He had not prepared for cheerful, instantaneous compliance. He snatched the papers off the island, clutching them to his chest like a shield. "You made the right choice," he muttered, his voice wavering with sudden uncertainty. He backed away toward the foyer, unable to tear his eyes away from my smiling face. "You will be out of this house by tomorrow morning. I will be gone by midnight," I replied cheerfully. Gavin turned and practically ran out the front door, desperate to secure the documents in his safe. He truly believed he had won. He truly believed he had just legally stripped me of my company and my wealth. He had no idea that by signing those specific divorce papers and executing that specific prenuptial agreement, I had just legally separated our financial liabilities. He had just signed a sworn federal affidavit claiming sole ownership of the offshore holding companies. The exact same holding companies Dominic had just finished linking to a massive international wire fraud and tax evasion syndicate. Gavin had not locked me out of my empire. He had just locked himself in a federal cage. The heavy oak door slammed shut, echoing through the empty foyer. I stood in the silence of the townhouse for exactly 10 seconds before I moved. I grabbed my trench coat and slipped out the back service entrance. Gavin thought he had a tail on me, but he vastly underestimated my understanding of urban logistics. I took a subway to Queens, switched to a local bus, crossed into Brooklyn, and walked 4 blocks through an industrial park until I reached an unmarked concrete building. The freight elevator groaned as it descended deep underground, stopping with a heavy metallic clank. I stepped out into a cavernous server room. The air was freezing deliberately, climate-controlled to keep the massive racks of processing units from overheating. The low, constant hum of cooling fans filled the space. At the far end of the room, bathed in the harsh blue light of 6 stacked monitors, sat Dominic. He did not look up as I approached. He simply tapped a key, and the largest monitor flared to life, displaying a dizzying interactive map of red and green nodes connecting hundreds of financial institutions. "Your ex-husband is a busy man," Dominic said, his voice a flat, steady baritone. He swiveled his chair to face me. "He is also incredibly arrogant. He used a military-grade encryption protocol to shield the initial transfers, but he got lazy with the routing numbers. He assumed no one would ever look hard enough to trace the digital shell game." "Show me," I said, pulling up a metal stool and sitting beside him. Dominic typed a command, and the screen zoomed in on a cluster of red nodes. "They have been running this operation for exactly 36 months. It started small, 5,000 here, 10,000 there, testing the fences. When they realized your internal accounting software was blinded by Gavin's master override, they escalated the extraction." He highlighted a thick green line connecting my corporate operating account to the Cayman Islands. "They were not just skimming page, they were systematically gutting your logistics empire." Gavin routed the capital through 3 separate blind trusts in the Caribbean before washing it through domestic real estate holdings and finally dumping the clean cash into the Madison Hope Foundation. "Your sister has been receiving an average of $200,000 a month for the past year and a half." I stared at the glowing numbers, feeling a cold, absolute calm settle over my mind. 3 years. Madison had launched her charity exactly 3 years ago. The massive press release, the tearful country club speeches, the sudden influx of mysterious wealthy donors. It was all a meticulously choreographed stage play funded entirely by my stolen capital. Dominic leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. He studied my face for a long moment. "I have audited cartels. I have tracked blood money for international warlords. I have seen every variation of human greed on the planet. But this level of intimate, coordinated destruction is rare." He gestured to the screen. "Gavin holds a federal wealth management license. Madison is running a registered nonprofit. They risked decades in federal prison to bleed your accounts dry. To go to these extremes, just to ruin you from the inside out, it requires a specific kind of malice. Why does your own family hate you this much?" I did not look away from the glowing data. The answer was simple. It was the fundamental truth I had ignored for my entire life. "My mother built a dynasty entirely on appearances," I said, my voice devoid of any emotion. "Sylvia engineered Madison to be the perfect society wife. She was bred to marry old money, to host galas, and to look flawless while contributing absolutely nothing of substance to the world. I was the designated failure. I was the quiet, awkward scapegoat who was supposed to struggle. I was supposed to be the cautionary tale that made their shallow, hollow lives look successful by comparison." I turned to look at Dominic. But I did not fail. I built an empire in a complex tech industry they do not even possess the vocabulary to understand. My success threatened their entire carefully constructed illusion of superiority. They could not tolerate the fact that the daughter they deemed worthless was suddenly holding more capital and power than their entire social circle combined. They had to destroy me to prove to themselves that I was still beneath them. Dominic held my gaze for a second before nodding slowly. He understood the psychology of greed better than anyone. He turned back to his keyboard. "Well, they made one fatal miscalculation," he said, his fingers flying across the keys. "They got greedy." Dominic executed a new search protocol. The massive web of transactions shifted. The primary green line routing money to Madison's charity dimmed. A new, previously hidden secondary funnel illuminated in bright, pulsing yellow. It bypassed the charity, entirely branching off from the second Cayman Island shell company and dropping straight back onto American soil. I noticed an anomaly in the wash cycle, Dominic explained, tracking the yellow line across the monitor. Gavin was siphoning off a 30% margin before the funds ever hit the foundation. I thought he was pocketing the cash for himself. But the destination account does not belong to your husband. The screen zoomed in on a Delaware limited liability corporation. Dominic ran a rapid unmasking script, stripping away the proxy layers protecting the corporate registry. The true owner of the LLC flashed on the screen, followed by a highly specific property address. My breath hitched. The glowing green text displayed a sprawling 8-bedroom estate in Connecticut. Sylvia. My mother had bragged to everyone at the country club last Thanksgiving about paying off the remaining mortgage on her multi-million-dollar estate in straight cash. She claimed it was the result of brilliant stock investments she had managed herself. She did not pay it off with stock dividends, I whispered, staring at the screen. No, Dominic said, his voice dropping to a grim whisper. She paid it off with the capital your husband stole from your company. Gavin routed $4 million directly to your mother's holding company. I gripped the edge of the metal desk. It was not just Gavin and Madison. The betrayal was total. My husband, my sister, and my mother were all intimately tied to the exact same offshore shell company. They were all co-conspirators in a massive coordinated federal wire fraud syndicate. And I finally had the absolute undeniable proof to bury all three of them. The sleek glass walls of my downtown logistics headquarters usually offered a sense of absolute control. Today they offered a front-row seat to a hostile invasion. I was sitting at my desk, reviewing the encrypted forensic files Dominic had transferred to my secure server, when the heavy glass door to my office swung open with violent force. The sharp, rhythmic clacking of designer heels announced her arrival before she even spoke. My mother, Sylvia, marched into the room looking like she had just stepped off the cover of a high society magazine. She wore a pristine white Chanel suit, her signature pearls, and an expression of absolute disgust. She had bypassed the security desk entirely, likely by threatening to destroy the career of the 22-year-old receptionist. Sylvia did not believe in locked doors when it came to my life. "You have humiliated this family for the last time, Paige," she announced, slamming her designer handbag onto my desk. She did not bother to sit down. She simply loomed over me, expecting me to immediately shrink into the awkward, obedient daughter I had played for 30 years. I slowly closed the encrypted file on my monitor and leaned back in my ergonomic chair. "Hello, Mother. I see Gavin gave you a full report on the gala." "Gavin is a saint for dealing with your psychotic episodes," Sylvia snapped, her voice dripping with venom. "He came to my house last night completely distraught. He told me about the divorce papers. He told me about your pathetic attempt to ruin Madison's charity event. You are acting like a petulant child throwing a tantrum because she does not understand how real adults manage wealth." She placed both hands flat on my desk, leaning in close. The heavy scent of her expensive perfume was suffocating. "I am here to put an end to this embarrassing spectacle," she stated. "You are going to withdraw that ridiculous divorce petition immediately. You are going to sign a formal addendum accepting the morality clause in your prenuptial agreement, which means you walk away with zero claims to Gavin's assets after your public meltdown. And tomorrow morning, you are going to issue a public apology to your sister and your husband." I stared at her, letting the absolute audacity of her demands hang in the sterile air of my office. "You want me to apologize to the people who are currently draining my corporate accounts?" "You do not have corporate accounts, Paige," Sylvia sneered, laughing a cold, brittle laugh. "You have a little computer project that Gavin was kind enough to manage for you. You should be on your knees thanking him for keeping you afloat. Instead, you act like a paranoid lunatic. You are going to fix this today to save the family's face. And if I refuse," I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. Sylvia stood up straight, crossing her arms. Her eyes turned as hard and black as obsidian. "If you refuse, I will officially disown you. Madison will disown you. Gavin will leave you with nothing. You will be entirely cut off from the only people who have ever tolerated your difficult, exhausting personality." She tilted her head, her voice dropping to a mockingly sympathetic whisper. "Look at yourself, Paige. You have always been the difficult one. You have always been cold and unlovable. If you fight us, you will have no one. You will die alone with your computers." The words were designed to strike the deepest, most vulnerable insecurities of my childhood. They were the exact words she used to use when I was a teenager, locking myself in my room to learn coding because I was not pretty enough or charming enough to fit into her country club world. She expected those words to shatter me. She expected me to fold. I looked at the woman who had birthed me. I thought about the Delaware Limited Liability Corporation. I thought about the $4 million of my stolen capital that had paid for the very mansion she slept in last night. I let my shoulders slump forward. I dropped my gaze to the floor. I forced my breathing to become shallow and ragged. I thought about the sheer magnitude of their betrayal and allowed a single genuine tear to spill over my lower lash line. I let my hands tremble as I brought them up to cover my face. "You always do this," I whispered, my voice cracking perfectly. "You always make me feel like I am nothing." Sylvia sighed an exaggerated sound of maternal inconvenience. She reached out and patted my head exactly as one might pat a disobedient dog that had finally submitted. "It is for your own good, Paige. You need boundaries. You need us to guide you. Now stop crying and be practical." I wiped my eyes, sniffing loudly as I opened the bottom drawer of my desk. I pulled out a thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy bond paper. The margins were dotted with bright yellow signature flags. "Gavin said I had to sign everything over to his management group," I mumbled, keeping my eyes downcast and my voice weak. "I had the corporate lawyers draft the final company release forms this morning. It transfers all administrative rights and acknowledges his full financial authority. I just want this to be over. I give up, Mom. You win." Sylvia smiled. It was a terrifying, triumphant smile. She snatched the silver pen from my desk organizer. "Finally, you are showing some common sense. Show me where to sign as the family witness and corporate guarantor." Gavin told me he needed my signature on file to validate the immediate transfer of the offshore holding accounts. "Right here," I said, meekly pointing a trembling finger to the yellow flags on the bottom of the stack. "And here. You have to initial the addendums acknowledging your role as a primary beneficiary of his wealth management trust." Sylvia did not read a single paragraph. She was too intoxicated by the absolute power of breaking me. She flipped through the pages, signing her elegant, sweeping signature exactly where I pointed. She initialed the dense legal jargon with rapid, dismissive strokes. She believed she was signing the documents that would legally strip me of my company and grant Gavin total control. She finished the last page and tossed the pen onto my desk. "There," she said, grabbing her handbag and adjusting her immaculate suit. "I will take these straight to Gavin. We will handle the press release regarding your temporary leave of absence for mental health reasons. Do not leave this office until you have drafted a suitable apology to your sister." Sylvia turned and marched out of the office, the glass door swinging shut behind her. I sat in the silence of my office, watching her strut down the hallway toward the elevators. The trembling in my hands vanished instantly. The tears dried. I sat up straight and pulled the hidden carbon copies of the signed documents from my desk drawer. Sylvia thought she had just signed a corporate surrender form. She had not read the fine print. She had just blindly signed a sworn federal declaration under penalty of perjury, legally identifying herself as the sole beneficial owner of the offshore shell company. She had just signed a document accepting full legal and financial liability for the $4 million embezzled from my logistics firm. My mother had just willingly handed me the murder weapon. I walked straight up to his desk, unclasped my briefcase, and slid the heavy stack of yellow-flagged carbon copies across the metal surface. "Read it," I said. Dominic picked up the first page. His eyes scanned the dense legal jargon rapidly. He flipped to the second page, then the third. The steady hum of the cooling fans was the only sound in the room. As he reached the final signature page, a slow, predatory smile spread across his face. He set the documents down gently, almost reverently. "Tell me what I am looking at," he murmured, though the gleam in his dark eyes told me he already knew. "You are looking at a masterclass in weaponized arrogance," I replied, leaning against the edge of his desk. "My mother believes she just signed the corporate release forms, granting Gavin total administrative control of my logistics software. She did not bother to read the fine print because she is entirely convinced I am a hysterical, incompetent child, incapable of executing a complex legal maneuver." Dominic tapped a specific paragraph on the third page. "This clause right here. It is an assumption of liability transfer. You embedded the registration numbers for the Delaware LLC directly into the asset relinquishment terms." "Exactly," I nodded. By signing those papers as the corporate guarantor, Sylvia legally acknowledged herself as the sole beneficial owner of that specific shell company. She explicitly accepted full financial liability for the $4 million holding the mortgage on her Connecticut estate. She did not just take the bait, she swallowed the hook, the line, and the sinker. We now have a sworn notarized admission tying her directly to Gavin's embezzlement syndicate. Dominic let out a low whistle, shaking his head in sheer admiration. It is brilliant, Paige. It is a flawless execution. Gavin's entire defense relies on plausible deniability and burying the money trail in offshore noise. But Sylvia just handed you a domestic confession. We spent the next 14 hours constructing the ultimate federal dossier. We did not sleep. We barely spoke. We fell into a seamless intellectual rhythm that was entirely foreign to me. Dominic pulled the transaction logs from the Cayman wash cycle cross, referencing them with Sylvia's newly signed liability forms. I built the data visualization models mapping the flow of stolen capital from my corporate operating accounts straight into Madison's fake charity and Sylvia's real estate holdings. It was an intricate, high-stakes dance of data and strategy. When I needed a specific routing number, Dominic already had it copied to my clipboard. When he needed a decryption key for the secondary blind trust, I had it queued up on his secondary monitor. We operated as equals. I paused at one point, watching him rapidly sort through a massive ledger of wire transfers. I realized with a sudden sharp clarity how fundamentally starved I had been for mutual respect. For years, Gavin had treated my intellect as a nuisance. He would snatch financial reports out of my hands, telling me not to worry my pretty little head about the big boy numbers. He would hide documents, dismiss my operational strategies, and belittle my ambition, labeling my massive logistics empire as a cute little project. He had systematically conditioned me to believe my competence was a flaw that made me unlovable. Dominic did not hide anything. He pushed a heavy encrypted hard drive across the desk toward me. The final master ledger. He said, his voice rough from exhaustion. I compiled the federal wire fraud statutes alongside the tax evasion codes. It is all yours. I reached for the drive. Our fingers brushed against the cold metal casing. Dominic did not pull away. He held my gaze, and there was no condescension in his eyes. There was no pity. There was only absolute fierce respect. You are a force of nature, Paige, he said quietly. Gavin never stood a chance against you. He was just too stupid to realize he was fighting a war he had already lost. I took the drive, a warmth spreading through my chest that had absolutely nothing to do with the freezing server room. We bound the printed dossiers into thick, heavy folders, one for the federal prosecutor, one for the presiding judge, one for the Securities and Exchange Commission. Every page was a nail in Gavin's coffin. By the time the morning sun began to filter through the small grate near the ceiling, the trap was fully constructed. We were just running the final encryption protocols when the heavy freight elevator groaned to life. Dominic instantly shifted, putting himself between me and the elevator doors, his hand moving toward the small of his back. I placed a hand on his arm, stopping him. It is fine, I said, checking my watch. I ordered breakfast. The elevator doors opened to reveal a terrified-looking courier holding a brown paper bag and a thick manila envelope. He practically threw the items onto a nearby crate before scrambling back into the elevator. I walked over and picked up the manila envelope. The return address belonged to Gavin's high-powered legal firm. I ripped it open and pulled out a single sheet of paper stamped with a court seal. Gavin is impatient, I said, reading the bold text. He pulled a massive favor with his country club judge. He filed an emergency motion for an expedited hearing. We have a mandatory court date set for tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. He wants an immediate ruling to enforce the prenuptial agreement and formally strip me of my company assets before I can mount a defense. Dominic walked over, standing close behind me to read over my shoulder. He thinks you are broke and terrified. He thinks you have no legal counsel and no leverage. He is rushing the execution because he thinks you are completely defenseless. My cell phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out. The screen lit up with a new text message from Gavin. See you in court, loser. I stared at the glowing screen. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face. Gavin thought he was dragging a hysterical, defeated woman into a courtroom to publicly execute her career. He had no idea he was dragging himself straight into a federal cage. I locked my phone screen, shutting out Gavin's pathetic digital taunt, and tossed the device onto the kitchen counter of the secure brownstone Dominic had procured for the night. The rain lashed against the reinforced windows, mirroring the quiet storm brewing inside the living room. Piles of bound federal dossiers covered every available surface. We had spent the last 3 hours preparing physical copies for the morning. Everything was ready. We just had to wait for the sun to rise. A sharp, deliberate knock at the front door shattered the silence. Dominic froze his hand, instantly dropping to the tactical holster concealed beneath his jacket. He moved toward the entryway with absolute fluid silence, checking the security monitor mounted on the wall. He relaxed his stance slightly, but his eyes remained narrowed. He tapped the screen, gesturing for me to look. Standing on the front porch, drenched in rain and shivering, was Dr. Elijah. Madison's husband looked absolutely nothing like the polished, composed pediatric surgeon who had practically dragged my sister out of the Pierre Hotel 2 nights ago. His designer trench coat was soaked through, clinging to his broad shoulders. His tie was missing, and his collar was unbuttoned, revealing the raw exhaustion etched into every line of his face. He looked like a man who had not slept in a week. He looked like a man who had just watched his entire world crumble. "Let him in," I said, my voice low and steady. Dominic unbolted the heavy deadbolts and swung the door open. Elijah stepped over the threshold, bringing the cold, damp scent of the storm inside with him. He did not immediately speak. He just stood there, water dripping from his dark hair onto the hardwood floor, staring at me with hollow, bloodshot eyes. "You were right," he finally rasped, his voice cracking. He sounded physically in pain. "Every single word you said into that microphone at the gala. You were absolutely right." Dominic quietly locked the door behind him, securing the perimeter, while I stepped forward. I did not offer a polite greeting. I did not offer him a towel. We were far past the point of social pleasantries. "What did you find, Elijah?" I asked. He let out a shaky breath, running a trembling hand over his face. "When I got Madison home from the gala, she was erratic. She was pacing the floor, screaming about how you were having a mental breakdown. She called Gavin 3 times before midnight. She tried to convince me that you had lost your mind and that Gavin was handling the crisis. But I remembered the look in your eyes, Paige. You did not look crazy. You looked like you were holding a winning lottery ticket." Elijah walked slowly into the living room, his eyes sweeping over the massive stacks of legal dossiers spread across the coffee table. He let out a dark, bitter laugh. "I hired an independent forensic accounting firm out of Chicago the next morning," he explained, turning back to face me. "I knew if I used anyone in Manhattan, Gavin would be alerted immediately. I paid them triple their standard rate for a 24-hour expedited audit. I told them to ignore Madison's foundation. I told them to look directly into the operating accounts for my pediatric surgical clinic." My stomach dropped. I glanced at Dominic, who was leaning against the archway, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression turning to stone. "They did not just use the charity," I said, the realization hitting me with sickening force. "No," Elijah whispered, his voice breaking. "The charity was just the public face of the operation. It was the shiny distraction. The real volume of the laundered capital was flowing straight through my clinic. Gavin washed almost $6 million of your stolen corporate funds through my pediatric surgical equipment procurement logs. They falsified invoices for MRI machines, incubators, and surgical lasers that never existed. They used my life's work. They used a clinic dedicated to saving dying children as a federal money laundering vehicle." He sank into one of the leather armchairs, dropping his head into his hands. His broad shoulders shook. The absolute devastation radiating from him was suffocating. He was a brilliant surgeon, a man who spent 80 hours a week fighting to pull children back from the brink of death, and his own wife had turned his sanctuary into a criminal enterprise. "How did she hide it from you?" Dominic asked, his tone devoid of its usual sharp edge, replaced by a quiet professional respect. Elijah looked up, his eyes burning with unshed tears and a deep, simmering rage. "She weaponized my career against me. Madison handled all the administrative and financial duties for the clinic. She told me I needed to focus on saving lives. Whenever I asked to review the quarterly ledgers or question a strange vendor invoice, she would turn it into a massive emotional battle. She would cry. She would ask me why I did not trust her. She would tell me I was letting the stress of the operating room make me paranoid. He stood up, pacing the length of the living room, the anger finally overriding the grief. She gaslit me for 3 years. She convinced me I was a terrible, ungrateful husband for daring to question her accounting. She isolated me in the operating room while she and Gavin sat in our dining room and gutted your company using my name. If this goes public, my medical license will be suspended. The federal government will seize the clinic. Everything I have ever worked for is gone. I watched him pace, understanding the exact psychological warfare he had endured. Madison and Sylvia shared the exact same playbook. They isolated their targets, convinced them they were incompetent or paranoid, and then stripped them bare. "You are legally exposed," I said, keeping my voice analytical to anchor him. "Gavin and Madison set you up as the perfect fall guy. If the feds raid the clinic, your signature is likely forged on every fraudulent procurement document." Elijah stopped pacing. He turned to face me, and the hesitation completely vanished from his posture. He reached inside his soaked trench coat and pulled out a heavy titanium-cased hard drive. He walked across the room and placed it directly on top of the largest dossier on the coffee table. "I am well aware of my exposure," he said, his voice turning to absolute ice. "But I am not going to let them hide behind my medical license anymore." "What is on the drive?" Dominic asked, stepping forward. "When Madison went to the country club this afternoon to coordinate her story with your mother, I cloned her personal laptop and her encrypted phone," Elijah explained, staring down at the silver rectangle. "She thought she was being clever, using an encrypted messaging app to communicate with Gavin. But she left the desktop client logged in on her private network." He looked up, meeting my gaze with a fierce, burning intensity. "It is all in there, Paige. 3 years of unencrypted communication between your husband and my wife. The wire transfer requests, the offshore routing numbers, the jokes they made about how easily they were manipulating both of us, the conversations about how they were going to divide your assets once Gavin forced you into a psychiatric hold. It is raw, unedited, and totally damning." Elijah took a step back, moving toward the front door. He did not look broken anymore. He looked like a man who had finally excised a tumor. "My court hearing is at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning," I said, watching him grip the doorknob. Gavin expedited the docket. "He plans to enforce the prenuptial agreement and seize my company administrative rights." Elijah opened the door, letting the sound of the pouring rain flood back into the quiet room. He looked back at me, the porch light casting sharp shadows across his face. "Then you have exactly 8 hours to integrate that drive into your presentation," he said. "Do not hold anything back, Paige. Do not show them an ounce of mercy." He stepped out into the storm, leaving me with one final instruction: burn them to the ground. The storm broke just before dawn, leaving the Manhattan streets slick and gray. I did not sleep. I spent the remaining hours meticulously categorizing the decrypted files Elijah had provided. Dominic stood by the window drinking black coffee, his posture rigid and alert. At exactly 8:15, we left the secure brownstone and took a private car to the federal courthouse. The heavy mahogany doors of courtroom 4B swung shut, sealing us inside. The clock on the oak-paneled wall read exactly 9 o'clock. We were no longer hiding in the shadows of Brooklyn's server rooms or conducting midnight audits in rain-soaked safe houses. We were standing in the harsh, unforgiving light of the federal justice system. Gavin sat at the plaintiff table, radiating a terrifying level of misplaced confidence. He wore a bespoke navy suit, his posture relaxed, his silver pens spinning idly between his fingers. Madison and Sylvia sat directly behind him in the gallery. They were dressed in matching designer pastels, treating the federal courthouse like a front-row seat at a charity fashion show. They whispered to each other, casting mocking glances in my direction. I sat at the defense table. Dominic was seated to my right, acting as my designated forensic financial consultant. A massive hardened briefcase rested at his feet. The encrypted hard drives, the transaction ledgers, and Elijah's damning communications cache were safely secured inside. Judge Marcus Vance took his seat at the bench. He was a man with 30 years of experience and a notorious reputation for absolute zero tolerance regarding corporate fraud. He surveyed the room with sharp, evaluating eyes before nodding to the bailiff to call the court to order. Gavin's attorney immediately launched into his rehearsed narrative. He paced in front of the bench, painting a tragic picture of a brilliant wealth manager trying to save the failing logistics company of his mentally unstable wife. He claimed I was frantic, prone to dangerous delusions, and entirely unfit to manage corporate capital. He insisted my recent actions, including my appearance at the charity gala, proved I was a danger to the company's shareholders. Sylvia could not contain herself. The moment the attorney paused to take a breath, she leaned forward over the wooden partition separating the gallery from the floor. "Tell them the truth, Paige," she hissed, her voice echoing loudly in the cavernous room. "Stop dragging this family through the mud. Confess to what you did. Accept the buyout and save Gavin the trouble of destroying you publicly. You are making an absolute fool of yourself." Judge Vance slammed his gavel down. The sharp wooden crack silenced the room instantly. "One more outburst from the gallery, and I will have you removed by federal marshals," Judge Vance warned, his voice dropping to a dangerous, gravelly register. "This is a court of law, not a country club arbitration. You will remain silent, or you will wait outside." Sylvia sank back into her seat, her face flushing crimson, but her eyes glared at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. Madison patted her mother's arm, shooting me a look of pure disgust. Gavin stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. He smiled apologetically at the judge, playing the role of the exhausted patient husband to absolute perfection. "Your Honor, my wife is not well," Gavin said, his voice dripping with manufactured sympathy. "I have tried to protect her from her own incompetence. I tried to shield her logistics firm from bankruptcy. But her paranoia has escalated. She has accused me of absurd financial crimes simply to distract from her own massive operational failures. Fortunately, she had a moment of clarity yesterday afternoon. She willingly signed a formal release recognizing my management authority and relinquishing her claims under the morality clause of our prenuptial agreement." Judge Vance adjusted his reading glasses. He looked down at the docket, then back up at Gavin. "You are claiming the respondent voluntarily signed over administrative rights and walked away from a multi-million-dollar enterprise overnight?" Judge Vance asked, his tone laced with skepticism. "Yes, Your Honor," Gavin replied smoothly. "Her own mother witnessed the signature and signed as the corporate guarantor. It is a legally binding transfer of liability. I asked the court to expedite the enforcement of these documents immediately to prevent further damage to the company." "I want to see the document," Judge Vance demanded, holding out his hand. "Hand it to the bailiff." "I am not interested in rhetoric today, Counselor. I want to see the physical proof you claim completely invalidates her corporate authority." Gavin smirked. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out the thick stack of bond paper. The bright yellow signature flags were still attached exactly where Sylvia had blindly initialed them the day before. He handed the stack to the bailiff with a triumphant, arrogant nod in my direction. The bailiff carried the heavy stack up to the bench. I kept my posture perfectly rigid. I did not look at Gavin. I did not look at Sylvia or Madison. I looked straight ahead at Judge Vance. Dominic sat perfectly still beside me, his dark eyes locked onto the judge, watching the trap spring shut. Judge Vance flipped open the cover page. He scanned the first few paragraphs. His expression was initially one of bored, judicial routine. Then he turned to the second page. His brow furrowed. He pushed his glasses further up the bridge of his nose. He turned to the third page, the one containing the embedded asset relinquishment terms. The silence in the courtroom grew heavy and oppressive. It stretched for 30 agonizing seconds, then a full minute. The smug, confident smile slowly began to melt off Gavin's face. He shifted his weight nervously, glancing back at Sylvia, who gave him a confused but reassuring nod. Judge Vance slowly lowered the document. He took off his glasses and placed them deliberately on the wooden bench. He did not look at Gavin. He did not look at Gavin's attorney. He looked straight past the plaintiff table directly into the gallery. He locked eyes with my mother. Counselor Judge Vance said, his voice deadly quiet. Are you aware of what your client just submitted to this court as evidence? Gavin's attorney stepped forward looking deeply confused. It is the corporate release form, Your Honor, signed and witnessed by Sylvia Hope, just as we stated. Judge Vance picked up the document and held it in the air. This is not a corporate release form. This is a sworn notarized federal declaration of asset ownership and liability assumption. Gavin froze. The color instantly drained from his face as he realized what had happened. He turned to stare at me, absolute panic flooding his eyes. Judge Vance read directly from the highlighted paragraph, his voice booming through the silent room. The undersigned guarantor hereby claims full beneficial ownership and complete financial liability for the Delaware Limited Liability Corporation, registered under the routing sequence ending in 482. The undersigned explicitly acknowledges the transfer of stolen corporate assets into said holding company. The judge dropped the paper onto his desk. The loud smack echoed off the marble walls. He stared directly at Sylvia, who was now gripping the wooden partition, her knuckles stark white. "Ma'am," Judge Vance said, his voice radiating absolute judicial wrath. "This document makes you the sole guarantor of the fraudulent shell company. You just assumed liability for $5 million of stolen funds." Sylvia did not gracefully accept the news. The immaculate posture that had defined her entire existence simply vanished in a fraction of a second. Her knees buckled beneath her, and she collapsed backward onto the hard wooden bench of the gallery. The sound of her breath hitching echoed sharply across the quiet room. Her manicured hands flew to her pearl necklace as if she were physically choking on the judge's words. $5 million. The exact amount of the fabricated mortgage on her Connecticut estate. The exact amount she had sworn under penalty of perjury she was entirely liable for. She slowly turned her head toward Gavin, the polished, sophisticated matriarch who had spent 30 years curating an image of absolute high society perfection, completely disintegrated before my eyes. Her face contorted into a mask of pure feral panic. The veneer of class and wealth evaporated, leaving nothing but a desperate, terrified, cornered animal. "You lied to me!" she shrieked, her voice cracking the sterile silence of the courtroom like a whip. "You told me those were administrative releases. You swore it was the final paperwork to take the company from Page. You said it was a simple liability waiver." Gavin scrambled out of his chair, his hands raised in a desperate attempt to silence her. "Sylvia, keep your voice down. Do not say another word on the record." But Sylvia was far beyond the reach of reason. The illusion of the flawless, classy family shattered into a screaming, chaotic mess right in the middle of federal court. She lunged forward over the polished oak partition, swatting wildly at Gavin's expensive navy suit. "You set me up, you arrogant little thief! You made me sign the liability forms for your stolen money. I will not take the fall for your sloppy embezzlement. I will not go to a federal penitentiary for you." Judge Vance did not immediately strike his gavel. He leaned back in his massive leather chair, folding his hands together, watching the prosecution table tear itself to shreds. He allowed the implosion to play out, recognizing exactly what was happening. Beside me, Dominic did not move a single muscle, but I could feel the cold, radiating satisfaction coming from his side of the table. We had built the trap, but we did not even have to push them into it. They were sprinting toward the ledge all on their own. Sylvia suddenly realized she was screaming in a federal courtroom. She whirled around to face the bench, abandoning her physical assault on Gavin. She gripped the wooden railing, tears spilling over her bottom lashes, ruining her meticulous makeup. These were not the calculated, elegant tears she had used in my office to manipulate me. These were the ugly, gasping, primitive sobs of a woman who finally understood she had walked directly into her own execution. "Your Honor, you must understand," she cried out, her voice trembling with manufactured frailty. "I am just an elderly woman. I do not understand corporate finance or offshore holding companies. I trusted my son-in-law. He manages all the family wealth. He handles all the investment portfolios. He told me Paige was having a psychiatric break and that I needed to sign those papers to protect the family assets. He manipulated me. I had absolutely no idea what I was signing. I sat perfectly still, letting her words wash over the court, taking immense pleasure in the irony. By attempting to play the fragile, ignorant victim, Sylvia had just delivered the final fatal blow to Gavin's defense. She had explicitly stated on the federal record that Gavin was the sole architect of the family wealth, completely destroying his legal claim that I was the mastermind behind the missing logistics capital. Gavin realized it instantly. He turned paler than the marble columns lining the walls of the room. Your Honor, my mother-in-law is clearly confused. She is highly distressed by her daughter's erratic behavior. I move to strike her outburst from the record immediately. You do not get to strike a spontaneous domestic confession, Counselor, Judge Vance said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, unyielding pitch. Your witness just admitted to signing a fraudulent liability transfer and explicitly named you as the orchestrator of the deception. You are standing on incredibly thin ice. The panic in the room was absolute. Gavin looked wildly toward his attorney, who was already zipping his briefcase shut, clearly preparing to formally withdraw as counsel and distance himself from the radioactive fallout. Then the movement came from the gallery. Madison, who had been sitting frozen beside her mother, suddenly scrambled to her feet. She looked at Sylvia sobbing against the railing. She looked at Gavin sweating and stammering before the judge. She saw the ship taking on water, and she immediately decided to throw both of them directly into the propellers. I did not know anything, Madison yelled, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at her husband and her mother. I had absolutely nothing to do with the offshore routing numbers. Sylvia stopped crying, turning to stare at her golden child in absolute shock. Madison, what are you doing? I am telling the truth! Madison snapped, her voice shrill with raw self-preservation. You two handled all the ledgers. Gavin moved the money into my charity foundation, and you authorized the disbursements to the real estate trusts. I never looked at the spreadsheets. I just hosted the gala events. I am not going to prison because you two got caught stealing from Paige. The sheer velocity of the betrayal left the courtroom breathless. The Golden Child had just admitted on the federal record that her charity was a money laundering front, and she had happily sacrificed her mother and her husband to save her own skin. They were rats in a barrel, tearing each other apart the moment the lid was sealed shut. Judge Vance picked up his gavel, his face a mask of absolute disgust, preparing to order the federal marshals to clear the room and place all three of them under immediate arrest. Before the wood could strike the sounding block, the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a resounding crash. The heavy, rhythmic sound of determined footsteps echoed down the center aisle. Every head in the room turned. Dr. Elijah walked past the gallery benches. He was no longer the exhausted, drenched man who had arrived at my safe house the night before. He was wearing his dark blue surgical scrubs, a crisp, tailored suit jacket thrown sharply over his broad shoulders. His eyes were dark, completely devoid of the warmth that usually defined his bedside manner. He carried the heavy titanium-encrypted hard drive in his right hand. He bypassed the gallery entirely, stepping directly up to the wooden gate that separated the audience from the legal floor. He did not look at his wife. He did not look at Gavin or Sylvia. He looked directly at the judge, holding the metal drive up to the light. Your Honor, Elijah said, his voice cutting through the remaining chaos like a surgical scalpel. My name is Dr. Elijah Sterling. I believe I have the specific financial evidence you need to secure those arrest warrants. Elijah stood tall at the wooden partition dividing the gallery from the legal floor. The heavy titanium drive gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights of the courtroom. The absolute silence in the room was deafening. Judge Vance stared at the pediatric surgeon, a flicker of profound recognition crossing his stern features. Elijah was not just another face in the crowd. He was a pillar of the Manhattan medical community, a man who sat on hospital boards and spearheaded regional health initiatives. His presence alone commanded immediate, undisputed authority. Step forward, Dr. Sterling, Judge Vance instructed, his voice losing the sharp, combative edge it had held moments before. Elijah unlatched the heavy wooden gate and walked directly toward the bench. His footsteps echoed with a heavy, deliberate cadence. He bypassed Gavin completely. Gavin was practically hyperventilating at the plaintiff table, his pristine posture replaced by a terrified slouch. Elijah did not spare a single glance for Sylvia, who sat frozen in the gallery, her hands still clutching her chest. He handed the drive to the bailiff, who immediately passed it up to the judge. That drive contains a complete cloned record of my wife's personal communications and the unedited, raw financial ledgers of my pediatric clinic, Elijah, stated, his voice carrying a calm, clinical precision. I initiated an independent forensic audit yesterday evening. The results confirm that Madison and Gavin orchestrated a massive domestic money laundering operation. They used my clinic's equipment procurement accounts to wash the stolen logistics capital before routing it into their private trusts. Madison shot up from her seat in the gallery. Her perfect pastel suit suddenly looked absurd against her panic-stricken face. The facade of the supportive, elegant wife shattered instantly. "Elijah, you are confused!" she shrieked, her voice pitching into a desperate, frantic whine. "You do not understand corporate finance. You belong in the operating room. Paige is manipulating you just like she manipulates everyone. You need to stop talking right now." Elijah finally turned to look at his wife. The sheer disgust in his eyes made Madison physically recoil. The man who had loved her, who had provided the respectable foundation for her high society ambitions, was gone. "I understand perfectly, Madison," he said, keeping his tone dangerously level. "I understand exactly why you insisted on handling the clinic's administration. You told me it was an act of love. You told me you wanted to free up my schedule so I could focus on my patients. But you just needed a clean, unassailable front. You needed a shield." He took a slow, deliberate step toward the gallery. "You picked the perfect cover. A Black pediatric surgeon who dedicated his life to community health initiatives. You knew the exact optics of the situation. You knew the Internal Revenue Service would hesitate to aggressively audit a man spending 80 hours a week saving dying children in underserved neighborhoods. You weaponized my race and my life's work to create a blind spot for your federal tax evasion." Madison shook her head frantically, tears ruining her immaculate makeup. "No, Elijah. I was protecting our family. I was building our future. You are ruining everything. You were building a federal indictment." Elijah countered, his voice echoing off the marble walls, cutting through her pathetic excuses. "Every single time I asked to see the vendor invoices, you played the victim. You told me I was paranoid. You told me my surgical schedule was making me delusional. You cried and asked why I did not trust my own wife. You used my absolute dedication to my patients to blindfold me while you and Gavin gutted your sister's company." Judge Vance picked up the titanium drive, turning it slowly in his hand. He looked down at Elijah with a heavy, solemn expression. "Dr. Sterling, are you fully aware of the implications of submitting this evidence?" Judge Vance asked. "You are implicating your own clinic in a massive federal financial crime. You are putting your own medical license and your professional freedom on the line." "I am fully aware, Your Honor," Elijah replied without a second of hesitation. "I will not allow my medical license to be used as a human shield for a criminal syndicate. The auditors have already separated the legitimate clinic funds from the laundered capital. Every single dollar Gavin routed through my accounts is tracked, documented, and verified. I will take whatever professional consequences come my way, but I will not be a party to this fraud." Gavin slumped forward until his forehead nearly hit the plaintiff table. The arrogant smirk was entirely gone, replaced by the vacant, terrified stare of a man watching a guillotine blade drop. His attorney had already backed away to the very edge of the legal floor, actively putting physical distance between himself and his radioactive client. Sylvia tried to speak, but the words died in her throat. She looked at Gavin, then at Madison, and finally at me. The realization that she had just signed a binding domestic confession assuming total liability for an empire of fraud was finally breaking her mind. She gripped the wooden partition, gasping for air as her entire world collapsed. I sat at the defense table with Dominic. We watched the masterpiece unfold in perfect synchronization. I did not have to say a single word. My sister had built her entire life on the illusion of superiority, and now her own husband was tearing down the walls, exposing the rot inside. Dominic leaned back slightly, his dark eyes tracking every movement in the room, ensuring there were no sudden threats. Elijah turned his attention back to the bench. He stood completely straight, radiating the quiet, formidable strength of a man who had made the hardest decision of his life. He adjusted his suit jacket, his expression hardening into pure resolve. "Your Honor, this is no longer a divorce proceeding," Elijah stated, his voice ringing with absolute finality. "The evidence on that drive goes far beyond marital asset disputes or corporate limited liability violations. What you are looking at is a coordinated federal conspiracy." Judge Vance leaned forward, placing both hands flat on his heavy oak desk. The entire courtroom held its breath. "And what exactly are you proposing, Dr. Sterling?" Elijah did not blink. He looked at Gavin, who was visibly trembling, then at Madison, who was sobbing uncontrollably into her hands. "I am not proposing anything, Your Honor," Elijah said, the cold reality of his words dropping the temperature in the room. "I am informing you that I have already contacted the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They are waiting in the corridor." The words hung in the sterile air of the courtroom, delivering an absolute death knell with cold clinical precision. The Federal Bureau of Investigation. The sheer weight of that specific title seemed to suck the remaining oxygen out of the cavernous room. Elijah stood perfectly still at the wooden partition, his broad shoulders squared, projecting the aura of a man who had just amputated a gangrenous limb to save the patient. Madison let out a guttural, wet gasp, sinking to the floor of the gallery, her face buried in her trembling knees. Gavin physically recoiled as if Elijah had just struck him across the jaw with a lead pipe. The transformation was instantaneous and entirely pathetic. For years, I had watched Gavin operate behind a flawless veneer of bespoke tailoring, expensive cologne, and arrogant smirks. He had always played the untouchable aristocratic patriarch, hiding his profound incompetence behind my business acumen and his mother-in-law's social standing. Now stripped of his stolen money and his manufactured prestige, the facade violently peeled away. He was nothing but a cornered, terrified coward. Sweat broke out across his forehead, gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. His hands shook violently as he grabbed the lapels of his suit jacket, pulling them tight against his chest, as if the fine Italian fabric could somehow shield him from a federal indictment. He spun around to face his attorney, who was already meticulously packing his legal pads into his leather briefcase, his eyes fixed firmly on the nearest exit. "Do something!" Gavin hissed, his voice cracking into a high, frantic pitch that echoed off the polished mahogany walls. "Object right now. Move for an immediate recess. Tell the judge that the hard drive is inadmissible evidence. I cannot object to a voluntary federal witness submitting direct forensic proof of ongoing fraud, Gavin." The attorney replied, his tone laced with absolute finality. "I am formally withdrawing as your legal counsel. I will not be a party to an active criminal conspiracy." Gavin grabbed the attorney's sleeve, his knuckles turning stark white from the force of his grip. "You cannot leave me here. We retract the divorce. Right now, tell the judge I withdraw the petition entirely. Withdraw the entire filing today." The attorney ripped his arm away, staring at Gavin as if he had completely lost his mind. He zipped his briefcase shut and took 2 large steps away from the plaintiff table, ensuring maximum physical distance between himself and his radioactive client. "Tell him," Gavin shouted, abandoning all remaining courtroom decorum. He turned wildly toward the bench, his chest heaving with ragged, uneven breaths. "Your Honor, I formally withdraw the petition for divorce. Paige is my wife. We are legally married. She is bound by spousal privilege. She cannot be compelled to testify against me in any capacity. I invoke my right to marital privilege immediately. You must strike all of her previous testimony and evidence from the official record." I sat at the defense table, keeping my spine perfectly straight, watching my soon-to-be ex-husband beg to remain chained to me simply to save his own skin. It was the ultimate display of his parasitic nature. He had spent months trying to destroy me, trying to gaslight me into a locked psychiatric facility, trying to steal the logistics company I built from the ground up with my own two hands. He had paraded his mistress around Manhattan and publicly mocked my sanity. Yet the very second he faced genuine, inescapable consequences, he threw himself at the altar of our marriage, desperately trying to use the vows he had decimated as a shield against federal prison. Dominic leaned slightly toward me, his muscular arms crossed tightly over his chest. He does realize marital privilege does not cover joint participation in a financial crime, right? Dominic murmured, his voice a low, dark rumble of pure amusement. Or crimes committed directly against the spouse. The man is completely unraveling. Judge Vance glared down at Gavin from the elevated bench, his expression radiating absolute judicial disdain. He did not even bother to consult the federal rulebook. "Mr. Sterling," Judge Vance said, his voice dropping into a gravelly register that commanded instant, absolute obedience. "You do not get to weaponize the sacred institution of marriage to cover up a multi-million-dollar federal embezzlement scheme. Marital communications privilege is entirely void when the communications relate to ongoing fraudulent activity. Furthermore, your wife is the direct financial victim of your corporate crimes. She is entirely free to testify against you. Your motion to withdraw the divorce is denied." Gavin's mouth opened and closed, but no sound materialized. He looked back at the gallery, desperately seeking the matriarchal protection he had relied on for the last decade. But Sylvia was utterly catatonic. She remained frozen on the wooden bench, her perfectly styled hair slightly askew, staring blankly at the opposite wall. She had signed legal documents assuming total liability for a shell company that the authorities were currently dismantling. She had absolutely no power left to wield. Madison was still weeping on the floor, entirely useless. Panic raw and absolute finally rewired Gavin's brain from desperate negotiation to pure flight. His eyes darted wildly around the courtroom. He looked at the heavy oak doors at the back of the room, then at the armed bailiff standing near the jury box. He took a slow, uncoordinated step away from the plaintiff table, then another. He bumped into his heavy wooden chair, sending it screeching loudly against the polished floor. "I need to use the restroom," Gavin stammered, his voice vibrating with absolute terror as he began to sidestep down the center aisle. "I am feeling incredibly unwell. I need to step outside for some air right now." He did not wait for judicial permission. He abandoned his expensive leather briefcase, his ruined legal strategy, and his fractured family. He broke into a frantic, stumbling jog, pushing past Elijah, who did not even blink or move an inch as the man rushed past him. Gavin was sprinting for the exit, abandoning every single ounce of dignity he had ever claimed to possess. Judge Vance did not shout. He did not stand up. He simply picked up his heavy wooden gavel and brought it down against the sounding block with a single deafening crack. "Bailiff, lock the doors." The uniformed officer moved with practiced lethal speed. He crossed the floor in 3 massive strides, grabbing the thick brass handles of the heavy oak double doors and pulling them shut with a resounding thud. The sharp metallic click of the deadbolt locking echoed loudly through the cavernous space, trapping Gavin exactly halfway down the center aisle. Gavin slammed his hands against the unyielding wood, rattling the brass handles in a desperate, futile frenzy. He spun around his back, pressed hard against the locked doors, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with absolute sheer terror as he realized there was no way out. The silence inside this courtroom was thick and suffocating. But outside, the harsh reality of Elijah's words was finally catching up to them. Through the thick wood and the solid marble walls, the sound began to penetrate the room. It was faint at first, then rapidly growing louder and more distinct. The sharp, unmistakable wail of approaching sirens cutting through the Manhattan morning, followed immediately by the heavy, rhythmic thud of tactical boots marching purposefully down the courthouse hallway. The heavy brass handles of the courtroom doors turned sharply from the outside. The bailiff unlocked the deadbolt, stepping back immediately. The door swung wide open, hitting the rubber wall stops with a resounding thud that made Gavin physically jump. 4 figures stepped across the threshold, moving with the synchronized precision of people who dismantle lives for a living. 2 wore dark navy windbreakers with the bright yellow letters FBI emblazoned across the back. The other two were dressed in immaculate gray suits, their lapels pinned with the unmistakable gold shields of the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. The lead FBI agent, a tall woman with steel gray hair and sharp, calculating eyes, walked directly down the center aisle. She did not look at Gavin, who was now pressed flat against the wooden partition. She did not look at Madison, who was still hyperventilating on the floor of the gallery. She walked straight to the bench and handed a thick stack of federal warrants to the bailiff. Judge Vance did not even need to read the entire document. He glanced at the federal seals, nodded once, and looked down at the plaintiff table. This court is officially suspending all proceedings regarding the dissolution of marriage between the plaintiff and the respondent, Judge Vance, announced, his voice booming through the silent room. Furthermore, I am dismissing the asset allocation petition entirely. Effective immediately, all domestic bank accounts, offshore holding companies, real estate trusts, and corporate logistical assets tied to the plaintiff are frozen. They will remain in federal custody, pending a comprehensive criminal investigation. Gavin let out a pathetic, strangled noise. His knees finally gave out and he slid down the wooden partition, collapsing into a heap on the polished marble floor. The bespoke suit he had worn like armor was now wrinkled and soaked in sweat. He was no longer a wealth manager. He was just a thief waiting for a cage. Dominic stood up from the defense table. He moved with a relaxed, fluid grace, completely unbothered by the federal agents swarming the room. He picked up the heavy, reinforced briefcase resting at my feet. The case contained every single piece of decoded evidence we had spent the last week pulling from the Cayman servers. He walked over to the lead IRS agent, extending his hand. The agent took it, offering a rare professional nod of genuine respect. Dominic handed over the briefcase. You will find the complete routing history of the stolen logistics funds, separated into individual offshore accounts, Dominic said, his voice calm and authoritative. The decryption keys are physically taped to the drives. The timeline matches the pediatric clinic ledgers perfectly. The IRS agent clicked the briefcase open, verifying the contents before handing it off to his partner. Thank you for your thoroughness, the agent replied. This saves us about 6 months of digging. Dominic turned away from the federal agents and walked slowly toward Gavin. Gavin was staring up at him from the floor, his eyes bloodshot and wide with absolute panic. For months, Gavin had dismissed Dominic. He had openly mocked him at the charity gala. He had told his lawyers and his country club friends that I was sleeping with a low-class hired thug just to spite him. He had built his entire divorce strategy on the assumption that I was a hysterical woman acting out of broken-hearted spite. Dominic stopped right in front of Gavin, looking down at him with an expression of pure, unadulterated pity. By the way, Dominic said, his voice dropping into a low, razor-sharp register that echoed perfectly in the quiet courtroom. I am not her lover. I am a forensic accountant. And I am the guy who just ruined your life. Gavin squeezed his eyes shut, pressing the heels of his hands against his forehead, as if he could somehow push the reality of the situation out of his brain. He had underestimated me. He had underestimated the man sitting next to me. He had assumed his fake morality, and his stolen wealth made him invincible. He had assumed wrong. The lead FBI agent signaled to her partner. The two agents moved methodically toward the plaintiff table. Gavin did not even try to run this time. He went entirely limp. The male agent grabbed Gavin by the bicep, hauling him roughly to his feet. Gavin Sterling, you are under arrest for federal wire fraud, embezzlement, and tax evasion. The agent stated, his voice loud and mechanical. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. The harsh, metallic ratcheting sound of steel handcuffs locking securely around Gavin's wrists filled the room. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of absolute finality. In the gallery, the second FBI agent approached Madison. She scrambled backward, knocking over a wooden chair, screaming at the top of her lungs. You cannot arrest me, she sobbed, thrashing wildly as the agent grabbed her arm. I am a philanthropist. I run a charity. Elijah, tell them to stop. Tell them I am innocent. Elijah stood at the wooden partition, his face a mask of stone. He looked down at the woman he had loved, the woman who had used his race and his reputation to launder stolen money. He did not say a single word. He simply turned his back and walked toward the courtroom exit, leaving her to face the consequences of her own boundless greed. Madison shrieked as the cold steel snapped around her wrists, pulling her arms sharply behind her back. She was dragged out of the gallery, her expensive pastel suit catching on the wooden benches, her carefully curated image completely demolished. While the room was entirely captivated by the screaming arrests happening in the center aisle, Sylvia quietly stood up. The matriarch had recovered just enough of her senses to realize she was the only one not currently wearing federal steel. She smoothed the front of her skirt, picking up her designer handbag with trembling fingers. She kept her eyes glued to the floor, sliding silently toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom. She thought she could slip away in the chaos. She thought her wealth and her status would give her one final invisible exit. She reached the back of the room, extending her manicured hand toward the brass door handle. A tall figure in a gray suit stepped directly out of the shadows, blocking her path. The second IRS agent smiled down at Sylvia, flashing a gold badge that caught the harsh overhead light. "Not so fast, Mrs. Hope," the agent said, pulling a pair of handcuffs from his belt. "We need to have a long conversation about your new shell company." The IRS agent did not flinch as Sylvia crashed into his solid frame. He simply reached out and caught her by the elbows, righting her posture with a cold, mechanical efficiency. Sylvia gasped, attempting to wrench herself free, her eyes wide with aristocratic indignation. She immediately defaulted to the only weapon she had ever truly wielded, her manufactured social superiority. "Do you have any idea who I am?" she demanded, her voice trembling but shrill. "I am Sylvia Hope. I sit on the board of the Manhattan Historical Society. You cannot simply accost me in a federal building. I demand you step aside before I make a phone call and have your badge revoked." The agent offered a tight, humorless smile. His hand moved to his belt, unhooking a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. "I know exactly who you are, Mrs. Hope," he replied, his voice carrying over the chaos of the room. "You are the sole guarantor of a fraudulent Delaware limited liability corporation. You are the primary signatory on a shell company used to launder $5 million of embezzled corporate funds. As for your friends on the board, I highly suggest you do not call them. We dispatched a secondary unit to raid the Historical Society's financial records 20 minutes ago." The remaining color drained from Sylvia's face. The realization hit her with the force of a freight train. There were no favors left to call in. There was no social ladder left to climb. She was entirely out of options. Across the aisle, Madison was faring much worse. The FBI agent had her pinned against the wooden partition, wrenching her arms firmly behind her back. Madison was thrashing like a spoiled child throwing a temper tantrum in a luxury boutique. "Stop touching me!" she shrieked, her voice echoing off the high vaulted ceiling. "You are bruising my wrists. These are custom Chanel sleeves. You are ruining my jacket. Do you know how much this suit costs? I am a philanthropist. I run a legitimate charity." The female agent did not hesitate. She slammed the steel cuffs around Madison's wrists, ratcheting them down tightly. The sharp click of the locking mechanism made Madison wail. The metal bit into her delicate skin, pressing hard against her diamond tennis bracelet. "Your charity is a money laundering front," the agent stated, reading Madison her Miranda rights in a bored, monotone voice. "You have the right to remain silent. I highly suggest you use it." Madison twisted her neck, looking wildly toward the courtroom exit. Elijah was standing near the heavy oak doors, watching the scene unfold with absolute surgical detachment. Madison locked eyes with him, her face contorted in a mask of pure desperation. "Elijah," she screamed, tears cutting deep tracks through her foundation. "Tell them to stop. Tell them I am your wife. You have to fix this. You cannot let them take me." Elijah did not flinch. He looked at the woman who had used his race, his medical license, and his dedication to dying children as a convenient shield for her rampant greed. He adjusted the cuffs of his pristine suit jacket, turned his back on her, and walked straight toward Dominic and me. He did not say a single word. He did not have to. His silence was the absolute loudest rejection possible. Gavin was currently being dragged to his feet by the second FBI agent. His bespoke navy suit was completely disheveled, his tie yanked sideways, his expensive Italian leather shoes scuffing awkwardly against the marble floor. The arrogant, untouchable wealth manager was gone. The man standing before me was a pathetic, desperate coward. He spotted me standing calmly beside the defense table. The sheer terror in his eyes morphed into a sickening display of vulnerability. He desperately tried to pull away from the agent lunging in my direction. "Paige," he begged, his voice cracking completely. "Paige, please. Tell them this is a misunderstanding. We were just restructuring the company assets. I was trying to protect our future. You know I love you. We are married. We can fix this. Please do not let them do this to me." I looked at the man I had once vowed to spend my life with. I looked at the man who had secretly funneled my life's work into offshore accounts, who had paraded his young mistress around the city, who had actively plotted to have me committed to a psychiatric ward to steal my entire company. I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sadness. Just the cold, clean satisfaction of watching a parasite finally get detached from its host. Dominic stepped smoothly in front of me, intercepting Gavin's line of sight. He did not say a word, but he squared his broad shoulders, forming a solid, impenetrable wall between me and the man currently begging for his life. The FBI agent yanked Gavin backward, forcing him toward the center aisle. Then the final break occurred. Sylvia shoved the IRS agent hard enough to slip out of his grasp. She did not run for the doors. She practically threw herself across the floor, stumbling and tripping over her own expensive heels. The woman who had spent 30 years criticizing my clothes, my posture, my ambition, and my very existence was suddenly crawling toward me. She collapsed right at my feet. The immaculate matriarch fell to her knees, her hands reaching out to grab the fabric of my skirt. Her carefully styled hair was coming undone, falling into her tear-streaked face. "Paige," she sobbed, her voice a ragged, desperate plea. "Paige, please. You have to call them off. You have to tell the judge I did not know. I am your mother. You cannot do this to me. The feds are going to seize the Connecticut estate. They are going to take everything. I will be homeless, Paige. I am your mother. You cannot let them put me on the street." I stood perfectly still, letting her grip the hem of my skirt. I looked down at her. 30 years of emotional abuse flashed through my mind. 30 years of being told I was not pretty enough, not elegant enough, not worthy of her affection. 30 years of watching her shower Madison with praise while actively participating in a plot to destroy my sanity and steal my money. I reached down and calmly pried her manicured fingers off my clothing. I smoothed the fabric of my skirt, taking a deliberate step back to look at the pathetic broken woman kneeling on the dirty courthouse floor. "Go find a bridge, Sylvia," I said, my voice dropping to a cold, deadpan whisper that cut through the noise of the room. "I hear they have great views. I am busy." I did not wait for her response. I turned my back on the sobbing matriarch, the screaming sister, and the begging husband. I walked straight up the center aisle. Dominic fell into step on my right, and Elijah joined me on my left. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom swung open, and the three of us walked out into the bright, unfiltered light of the Manhattan morning, leaving the wreckage of my former family entirely in the hands of the federal government. The crisp morning air of Manhattan felt like breathing for the very first time. Leaving the courthouse with Dominic and Elijah, I did not look back. I did not need to. The federal machine had finally taken over, and it was a brutally efficient grinder. Over the next 4 weeks, the absolute destruction of my former family played out across the front pages of the Financial Times and the glowing screens of local news networks. Gavin experienced the harshest reality check of his miserable existence during his detention hearing. He stood before a federal magistrate judge completely stripped of his tailored armor. His defense attorney, appointed by the court after his private counsel fled, argued desperately for house arrest. The federal prosecutor countered by presenting a massive mountain of encrypted evidence, showing Gavin had actively attempted to wire funds to a non-extradition country moments before the courtroom raid. The judge did not hesitate. Bail was denied due to extreme flight risk. Gavin collapsed against the defense table, weeping openly in front of a packed courtroom gallery. He begged the marshals to let him make one more phone call, but his pleas fell on deaf ears. He was remanded immediately to the Metropolitan Detention Center. The man who once berated me for buying the wrong vintage of Bordeaux was now forced to trade his silk ties for a scratchy, oversized orange jumpsuit. He was locked in a concrete cell containing a metal toilet and a thin mattress stripped of his name and reduced entirely to a federal inmate number. Madison fared no better in the court of public opinion. Her carefully curated life dissolved with terrifying speed. The philanthropic society she had used as a shield publicly disavowed her within 24 hours of her arrest. The wealthy socialites who used to drink expensive champagne in her pristine living room suddenly developed collective amnesia, claiming they hardly knew her. She was entirely radioactive. Her phone calls from the holding facility went unanswered. Her exclusive country club membership was revoked instantly. Elijah moved with the same surgical precision he applied in the operating room. He did not grant Madison a single visit or accept any of her frantic collect calls from the federal lockup. Instead, he sent his legal team. Elijah filed for an expedited divorce and full sole custody of their children. He submitted the federal indictment, the raw financial ledgers, and the proof of her domestic money laundering as evidence of her profound moral and legal unfitness. Madison was served her divorce papers in the cold, sterile visitor room of the Federal Holding Center. She had spent her entire adult life playing the perfect supportive wife to mask her profound greed. Now she sat alone, wearing an orange jumpsuit, entirely abandoned by the high society circle she had sacrificed everything to impress. She had absolutely nothing left to leverage. But the most poetic justice was reserved entirely for Sylvia. The matriarch who had spent 3 decades meticulously crafting an illusion of superior wealth was violently dragged back to reality. The Internal Revenue Service did not care about her position on the Historical Society board. They cared about the $5 million funneled through the shell company she had proudly signed her name to. The asset seizure was swift, absolute, and entirely public. Federal agents arrived at her massive Connecticut estate with moving trucks and immediate eviction notices. Sylvia was given exactly 2 hours to vacate the premises she had lorded over everyone else. I received a profound sense of closure watching the evening news broadcast a shaky cell phone video of the event. Sylvia was standing in the cracked driveway of a rundown roadside motel on the absolute outskirts of the city. The sprawling Connecticut mansion, the luxury cars, and the catered dinners were completely gone. She was dragging 2 scuffed vinyl suitcases across the wet asphalt, her shoulders slumped in defeat. The neon sign above the motel office flickered erratically, casting a cheap, harsh red light over her unkempt hair and stained blouse. She looked completely hollowed out. For 30 years, Sylvia had built her entire identity on elevating Madison and destroying me. She had actively participated in my psychological torture, entirely convinced that her golden child and her wealthy son-in-law would insulate her from consequence. She had treated me like dirt beneath her designer shoes. Now she was completely stripped of her fake wealth, her favorite daughter, and the son-in-law who had bankrolled her delusions. She was entirely alone, forced to sleep in a damp motel room reeking of stale cigarette smoke. She had bet her entire life on the wrong horse, and the house had finally collected its due. I did not waste a single second gloating over their respective ruins. I had an empire to rebuild. I sat behind the massive glass desk in my newly reclaimed corner office. The logistics company I had built with my own blood and sweat was finally purged of Gavin's toxic influence. Dominic stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the sprawling Manhattan skyline. His forensic audit had successfully recovered the vast majority of the embezzled capital, and the board of directors had unanimously reinstated me as the sole chief executive officer. The toxic rot was gone. The corporate accounts were secure. The company was stronger, leaner, and entirely mine. I opened a fresh leather notebook, writing down the aggressive expansion plans I had been forced to put on hold during Gavin's reign of terror. The sunlight caught the sleek surface of my desk, reflecting the bright future ahead. The sharp trill of my private desk phone shattered the quiet focus of the room. I picked up the heavy receiver, resting it against my ear. Paige speaking. I answered, my voice steady and commanding. It was my lead underwriter at Goldman Sachs. His voice was practically vibrating with adrenaline. Paige, we just got the final green light, he announced. The federal clearance came through this morning. The Securities and Exchange Commission has formally approved the filings. We are ready to launch the initial public offering. I leaned back in my heavy leather executive chair, a slow, triumphant smile spreading across my face. I looked over at Dominic, who offered a knowing nod of respect. Ring the bell, I said. The heavy wooden gavel struck the polished brass bell with a resonant clang that vibrated through the soles of my shoes. The sound echoed across the massive, historic expanse of the New York Stock Exchange. A roar of applause immediately erupted from the crowded trading floor below. I stood on the iconic balcony, bathed in the harsh, bright lights of a dozen news cameras. 1 month had passed since I sat in my office and gave Goldman Sachs the green light. Today, my logistics company was officially a publicly traded entity. I gripped the intricately carved wooden railing and looked out over the sea of traders. Massive digital monitors spanned the walls, flashing neon green numbers that shifted with lightning speed. The opening price surged instantly. We had priced the initial shares conservatively, hoping for a steady morning climb. Instead, the market responded with a ferocious, insatiable appetite. The ticker symbol for my company blazed across the main screen. The share price doubled within the first 40 minutes of trading. The financial analysts standing near the podium were furiously tapping on their tablets. One of the lead bankers leaned over the railing, his face flushed with adrenaline. He shouted over the din of the trading floor, confirming the final opening valuation. $2 billion. $2 billion. I let the number wash over me. It was not just a financial metric. It was absolute, undeniable proof of my existence. Staring down at the frantic, beautiful chaos of the trading floor, the ghosts of my past tried to whisper in my ear. I could vividly hear Sylvia's sharp, aristocratic voice echoing in the grand hallways of her now seized Connecticut estate, telling me I was a severe disappointment to the family legacy. I could hear Gavin's arrogant sneer as he sat in our dining room, calling my business a cute little hobby meant to keep me distracted. I remembered every single time I was told I was useless, too aggressive, too difficult to love. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the roaring applause drown out those phantom voices forever. They had tried to bury me under a mountain of gaslighting, federal fraud, and emotional manipulation, but they did not realize the pressure was simply forging my armor. Every insult, every stolen dollar, every coordinated lie had just been raw material. I had taken their toxic abuse and fed it directly into the furnace of my ambition. I was not the scapegoat anymore. I was the architect of an empire that dwarfed their wildest, most greedy imaginations. While I stood on the precipice of absolute financial victory, the architects of my misery were experiencing a very different kind of reality. The past month had been a rapid, brutal montage of their utter destruction. Gavin had faced a federal magistrate judge completely stripped of his tailored armor and his condescending smirk. His public defender had argued desperately for house arrest, citing his lack of prior criminal history. The federal prosecutor had simply dropped a 500-page encrypted ledger on the judge's desk, proving Gavin had actively attempted to wire stolen funds to a non-extradition country moments before his arrest. Bail was denied instantly due to extreme flight risk. The man who once berated me for buying the wrong vintage of Bordeaux was now locked in a concrete cell wearing a scratchy, oversized orange jumpsuit, entirely stripped of his name, and reduced to a federal inmate number. Madison fared no better in the merciless court of public opinion. Her carefully curated life dissolved with terrifying speed. The philanthropic society she had used as a shield publicly disavowed her within 24 hours. The wealthy socialites who used to drink expensive champagne in her pristine living room suddenly developed collective amnesia, claiming they hardly knew her. She was entirely radioactive. Her exclusive country club membership was revoked, and her phone calls from the holding facility went completely unanswered. She was a pariah in an orange jumpsuit, stripped of her designer wardrobe and her fake moral superiority. But the most poetic justice was reserved entirely for Sylvia. The matriarch, who had spent 3 decades meticulously crafting an illusion of superior wealth, was violently dragged back to reality. The Internal Revenue Service moved with lethal efficiency. The bank formally seized her massive Connecticut McMansion, the luxury cars, and the hidden accounts. I had received a profound sense of closure watching the evening news broadcast a shaky cell phone video of her final eviction. Sylvia was standing in the cracked driveway of a rundown roadside motel on the absolute outskirts of the city. The sprawling estate and the catered dinners were completely gone. She was dragging 2 cheap, scuffed vinyl suitcases across the wet asphalt, her shoulders slumped in absolute defeat. She was completely stripped of her golden child daughter, her son-in-law, and her fake wealth. She was entirely alone. A warm, heavy hand settled firmly against the small of my back, pulling me out of my dark, satisfying reflections. I turned my head and looked at Dominic. He was standing right beside me, wearing a flawlessly tailored charcoal suit that commanded just as much authority as the federal agents he had coordinated with a month prior. He was no longer just the brilliant forensic accountant who had meticulously dismantled Gavin's life. Yesterday, the board of directors had unanimously approved my recommendation to appoint him as the formal chief financial officer of the company. He stepped closer, the physical distance between us vanishing entirely. The strict professional boundary we had maintained during the federal investigation was gone, replaced by a quiet magnetic pull that neither of us had any intention of resisting. "You built a fortress, Paige." Dominic murmured, his voice a low, steady rumble that sent a pleasant shiver down my spine. "The market is absolutely eating it up. You won." "I did not win a lottery," I replied, keeping my gaze locked on his dark, intense eyes. "I built a machine, and we are just getting started." I felt a short, sharp vibration in the pocket of my tailored blazer. I pulled out my phone and swiped the screen. It was a text message from Elijah. There were no words, just a single high-resolution photograph. Elijah was standing on the white sands of a pristine private beach, the turquoise ocean stretching out endlessly behind him. He looked younger, lighter, completely unburdened. His 2 children were clinging to his broad shoulders, laughing uproariously at the camera. He had filed for full legal and physical custody of his kids and pushed through a clean, expedited divorce. He had saved his family by surgically removing the infection. A uniformed attendant approached us carrying a silver tray lined with crystal flutes. Dominic picked up 2 glasses and handed one to me. The champagne was perfectly chilled, the tiny bubbles racing to the surface in a continuous stream of celebration. I turned back toward the balcony railing, looking out over the empire I had constructed from scratch. I raised my crystal flute, letting the rim clink gently against Dominic's glass with a sharp musical chime. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the expensive champagne. The cold, crisp liquid tasted like absolute freedom. I was completely unburdened, entirely untouchable, and holding the reins of a $2 billion empire I had built with my own 2 hands. The most profound lesson from these stories is that our true worth is never defined by people who fail to see it. Whether facing deep betrayal, sudden abandonment, cruel rejection, or extreme emotional neglect, seeking validation from toxic family members only leads to heartbreak. True security comes from building an independent life, cultivating authentic relationships, and trusting your own resilience. Walking away from ingrained family dysfunction is incredibly painful, but it creates the necessary space to discover genuine happiness. Share your own story of finding peace after walking away from a toxic environment in the comments down below with us.